1 second, we're not live.
Representative Kinner.
Here.
Representative Larson.
Here.
Representative Olson. Oh, excuse me.
From 2 years ago.
Apologies, Mr. Chairman. Representative Schwartz.
Here.
Representative Simpson.
Here.
Representative Stith.
Here.
Representative Walters.
Excuse.
Senator Guru. Here. Senator Hicks. Senator Kinski. Senator Steinmetz. Co-Chairman Perkins.
Here.
Chairman Nicholas.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Okay, do we have any preliminary matters? Mr. Co-Chair, any comments before we jump into the schedule? Okay, with that, Don, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, I think the first item is in your packet. The summary of proceedings from the June 15th meeting is available for your motion.
We have a motion.
Second.
Moved by Representative Groove, seconded by Representative Larson. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, that motion carries. Next, update, CARES Act, ARPA Act, actual and planned expenditures. Rennie?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Rennie McKay, Governor Mark Gordon's Policy Director, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I'm joined by Erica Legursky, and she is Governor Gordon's Senior Policy Advisor for budget matters and a few other budget policy issues as well. And we have some slides to share with you that should be in your packet. And also, as soon as I can present and share a screen, I'll pop that up. But I'll help you move through that because I believe you've got a paper version as well with you right now. So the main goal here is to give you an update on spending of CARES Act funds. Those are the 2020 CARES Act, and also an update on the American Rescue Plan Act and discretionary funds that came to state government. So be able to walk you through that here as quickly as I can, and I am about to be able to share my screen with you. All right. Got to the end already.
It's a good
Any
place to
questions?
start.
That was a little quick. Could you go back?
Excellent. So here, just as we all know, but just to put some particulars on the situation we're in is that with the COVID relief that has come from the federal government, I think there's over 6 bills that passed Congress that were COVID relief. And all told, those 6 bills brought more than $8 billion to Wyoming. And the lion's share of that were the direct payments to individuals that most people received. And then the second largest was the PPP program, and so direct federal aid right to businesses. But those 1.25 billion in CARES Act was the discretionary amount available to the state in 2020. And then the ARPA funds that have come so far are 534 million, and that's half of what Wyoming expects to receive. Second half should be here in May of next year. So again, there are a lot of federal dollars and COVID relief dollars coming to the state of Wyoming, but these are the ones that there are some discretion around how the spending goes here in the state. So then just a reminder too is we've been planning on this. We'll focus right now for a couple slides on the CARES Act, again, what came in 2020 and where that was allocated, where that was spent, and what's remaining. And really with what was remaining is that act expired on at the end of December of 2020. And that was our deadline to spend until about 3 days before that, when the deadline to spend was extended. So there's not a lot of CARES Act left at the end of 2020 and available now, but there is work being done to get reimbursements from FEMA for some eligible expenses. And with what is remaining, we're really focused on what we believe is the survive part of our planning. And that means, what do we do to make sure that we can get through the pandemic, both from the public safety side of things, but also from the livelihood perspective. So, and as you recall, the CARES Act had the filter of both the federal act and then the special session legislation that passed in May of 2020. So we're layering both the federal law and the state law to guide how the CARES Act have been spent. And we believe that they've been spent strategically that did help Wyoming to manage the pandemic and that crisis as well as possible. So here we're looking at what the plan was, and we try to keep you well updated about what the plan was through last year. And you can see the emphasis was on protecting lives, so spending on healthcare, testing, contact tracing. And then another major emphasis was on preserving livelihoods with investments in business relief. So those were the two largest buckets of spending with the CARES Act. And then this is your update now on CARES Act. And so there's a lot of detail here, but what we want to show you is where dollars did go. And again, compliments to the state auditor who has the website Why Open. So if you're looking for specific expenditures and where dollars went and to whom, the state auditor's office has done a great job of providing that information in a way I think that is unique in the country. But what you can see here is the encumbered column. Wolf's encumbered shows that there are some funds that were under contract but not spent yet. And so they're still processing some contracts here. And then as you look, there's also an allocation there of that 13.8 of what is unobligated. And one consideration that we're working with is the provision in Senate File 118 from 2021 that means that $20 million must qualify under the language of Senate File 118. And that language, just to try to summarize it, says that if a project, procurement, or grant had to have been approved in 2020 but not spent, and so that's what is eligible for that $20 million, and that's one of the factors we're working with here as we move through this year and track dollars. So the other columns we'll get into a little bit more in the following slides. If you're ready for that, I'll move on.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rennie, I was just wondering if you by chance have a little more breakdown on your healthcare on both of these. It includes mental health. Do you guys by chance have that breakdown on mental health, what was spent on mental health, and I'm curious on what direction that went. Did that go to the community mental health providers or private providers? Do you think that we can maybe get that? I'm just curious on, because it still seems to be an issue as we move forward on some of that. And then a follow-up question would be and maybe you're going to cover this later, and if so, that's great, is on some of the large business stuff. We had a lot of our larger employees that we reached out to help that didn't lay off because they knew that they would lose their people. And so that really impacted their bottom line. But then as we reviewed that, it looks like getting those requests processed perhaps maybe been a little slower, or if that's the right word. And I'm just curious on if you feel like if you were going to do that over, did we take care of that the best way? And I know that we were plowing new ground, but any thoughts on some of those larger business loans that are opportunities and how we can, and do we have some, I understand that we're still waiting to get some of that processed. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman. I'll answer your second question first. So I believe you're referring to that program that was stood up last year that was to target or made out some larger businesses eligible. And the focus was on COVID-related costs that they had to incur. And so it was a little bit different than the smaller businesses. And so certainly there's a lot we learned from last year, and we were going at a speed that we're not used to. And I think a lot of people were uncomfortable because of just trying to get the dollars out the door and into people's pockets where it provided that relief that was necessary to help them survive. But we're doing audits now as well. So I think we are able to still make some adjustments and make sure that the money was spent well. I guess on your point is what you're saying is that program in particular, the administration of it. I haven't heard that there's any payments that still need to go out through that specific program at this time to the large businesses. So I believe that those all would have been paid. But if you do have some instances of that, I know the Business Council has been very responsive. So if we can just put the business in touch with the Business Council and its staff, I think we should be able to resolve if there's anything left.
Okay, thank you. Mental health.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
For mental health, and thanks to Stefan Johansson and his team over at Health, I could get you a really good breakdown of where the money in 2020 and so far in 2021 has gone to mental health care providers with a focus on community providers. This has been one of the other challenges of all of this COVID relief is that there's 6 bills and many of them created different programs. So understanding all of the different funds that have become available in different sectors, and mental health is definitely one of the sectors where there's a lot of programs stood up and created by all those different federal bills. So there's quite a good breakdown that I can get you because of the work of the Department of Health that shows where money went so far and how it looks across the different programs, because it's complex. So we'll get that to you, and Mr. Chairman, we can provide that to the entire committee.
Right, please proceed.
All right. As we were looking at all the planned expenditures there as well coming up, this slide is specific to a section of Senate File 118, and that was the section that allowed for the recreation of programs from 2020. So the program didn't exist under statute prior to COVID, and the special session legislation allowed the governor to create programs with the sideboards that was in that or in the various bills that passed. And so then Senate File 118 allowed the recreation of those programs, but capped the amount of money that could be spent on recreated programs at 18 million. So this is that shows that the 2 programs that we've stood up so far that are recreated from 2020, and the focus again here is to help survive the pandemic and its economic impacts. So we believe these programs in particular make a difference by getting more people back to work and by impacting employment opportunities and the resilience of communities, both in the ag sector and in the energy sector.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rennie, on the Energy Rebound Program, is there any mechanisms in place to sort of track that going forward and to say these dollars were spent and we did this with those dollars to see what the outcomes might be?
Mr. Chairman, we believe we do have good mechanisms in place, both to track the number of people that were working on the projects that were funded through the Energy Rebound And also we know have well data. So there's two real emphases of that program. One is to if a project was delayed because of COVID, this is to help get it going again. And so that should have two impacts for the state. It should help people if it's a recompletion of a well, then hopefully we're getting more people back to work on that recompletion project. And also the other part about that recompletion is that we then get the production and the revenue from it. And so we do have information on those wells, so we could track both of those aspects of this program and have some data from last year as well. And the other side of it again is that the plugging wells, so capping and plugging wells. So I think one thing too is we're putting more people to work on those projects, and that helps us long term, because this is going to be a need that we're going to have for that we've always been working on. But this is, I think, a great way to get people to work.
Okay, thank you.
So Rennie, if you go back to the prior one, the column 1 and 3 would be those two programs. Is that right? I'm just trying. 12 million for energy rebound is column 3. Business economic development, including agriculture. Is that right? The 12 million. And the 2 million is the column 1, the first column, agribusiness relief. Correct.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. The row, I believe.
Right. Well, so where are you've got obligated waiting wolves documents? What does that mean? I mean, how far along are they, and when do we expect to have them act on and committed, the funds delivered?
Mr. Chairman, on those two programs, the applications have been open and completed. So we believe that on the agriculture, we'll have those payments out by the end of July. And the energy rebound is a reimbursement program. And so but we let the applicants know that they have been approved ahead of time. So they've now been notified as of last week. So that will be processed here in the coming months. I don't think that takes too long.
You have 54 applicants, but 216 projects approved. So do some applicants have multiple projects? Is that why there's, I'm just trying to understand those numbers.
Mr. Chairman, that's exactly correct.
And on the meat processing, particularly, where's that at and what projects have been approved?
Mr. Chairman, I believe we're not yet at having all of the projects approved on that. And so that one, again, we're in process, but do believe we'll be starting to make payments by the end of the month. So we can follow up with you on that one to give you some specifics about where projects are getting money and which parts of the state. So
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. Go ahead, Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Randy, on your energy rebound projects or programs, would you remind me, was that solely on the production side, or did that was that made available downstream, like to your refiners and other associated industries? I just can't remember how that program was laid out.
Mr. Chairman, that program was targeted at the production or also at the field level. So it was really the program that you mentioned earlier is the one that a refiner would have been eligible for last year. So this is to both stimulate production that was delayed because of COVID, and also then to put people to work on plugging wells.
Okay. Please proceed.
So some other CARES Act expenditures, and these are detailed again on that table. You can see generally where these are at, but the goal here was a focus on the tourism and outdoor recreation economy. And these programs, so this funding didn't require the recreation of a program. So we were using existing authorized authority to fund these efforts. And so again, these are out the door. The broadband strategic mapping part of that is obviously not in the tourism sector, but that's one of the projects that we really believe helps set us up well for the future. And as we get into any discussion about the Connect Wyoming program, the idea with this mapping is that we realized that was a challenge last year, and to be as accurate as possible, we needed to invest in some mapping to understand more about which parts of Wyoming are unserved and which parts are underserved. But the other two programs are getting underway as well. And so already there's been an expansion at several of the campgrounds around the state, and that's benefiting the capacity there and bringing in more visitors to the state.
So Renee, just, do you have examples of what the 5 million tourism is being used for? I mean, is it other than safe travel marketing campaigns?
Mr. Chairman, again, with CARES Act, there has to be a tie back to a response and be necessary to respond to COVID. And so a big focus on that is the marketing Wyoming and showing and trying to get people who can come here kind of for a last minute trip. Because again, we're targeting this year. This isn't a longer term investment. These are all about this year. And so the focus is just letting people know what opportunities do exist in Wyoming, and helping that sector rebound. So it's going out to, Visit Cheyenne, would be the type of entity that would get one of those grants, so they could market opportunities here in this part of the state, and get people to come up and visit, who were, ideally trying to stimulate that sector as well.
So, and it's being managed by whom? By tourism or?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. The Office of Tourism
So they
took applications.
Visit Cheyenne, or the Fremont County Tourism Board makes an application to the tourism folks. And so, how much has been expended, or how much of that 5 million?
Mr. Chairman, that 5 million has been processed and I believe is over at the Office of Tourism. And as I understand it, they had applications for all of it. So now they're just making those payments out to the DMOs. Great. So this slide is potential CARES Act expenditures. Am I done? These are proposals for CARES Act that we do not or not making yet as we process. There's two different accounting issues that will allow us to fund these projects. One of them is the application to FEMA for reimbursement, and the other one is finding qualified expenditures for that $20 million that's set aside in Senate File 118. So these are our plans for spending if we are able to here this year, if the funds become available either through one of those two avenues. And again, I think the hallmark of this one is the tax relief for businesses. This is really where we're putting our major focus for that business survival in 2021. And I've worked with the Department of Workforce Services and have this all ready to go. And so the tax credits we're aiming for the quarter that begins in September for that program. So I know you've got some more questions for the Department of Workforce Services later this morning on that particular program. But as you can see, these are some areas where we want to put dollars into trying to offset and mitigate mental health and substance use. Suicide also is part of what we're thinking on this planning, and then trying to take advantage of some other opportunities where there was some COVID impacts where we think we can make a difference to help offset some of the negative effects of COVID, both on individuals in state government services and also outside of them. And then also have the plan. This would be something we did last year as well, and that's trying to prevent the loss of commercial air service by making an investment into that program.
Any updates on how far along the FEMA applications are in place and timing wise?
Mr. Chairman, I've got a slide on that Ms. Legursky will walk you through here shortly. So again, quickly, just want to now shift gears into the future. And this is the American Rescue Plan Act expenditures and that planning. So very little money has been expended on ARPA projects. At this time, it's been the administration of those dollars, working with the budget department in our office to make sure that we can manage these funds appropriately. The state auditor's office, again, has been a great partner in both the CARES Act and in ARPA. So working with them as well on administering and tracking these. The reporting for ARPA is more significant than CARES. I believe our first report is due August 31st, if I'm recalling that correctly. So the work on ARPA reporting and transparency will be pretty significant for the state and also for those local entities that have received funds. But as we look at the American Rescue Plan, the reason that we're taking that slower approach, just to remind everybody, is that we have until the end of 2024 to obligate the funds, and then the end of 2026 to spend them. So it gives us the opportunity to be much more thoughtful and I think strategic in how the dollars are spent. And that's been a major focus for the governor. So as you can see here on this next slide, the criteria established for funding puts that as a premium that the governor believes, since we are continuing to add to the federal debt, we should be very thoughtful about trying to make investments that benefit those people who are going to have to repay that loan, and that's our grandchildren and great grandchildren. And so trying to work with a strike team that involves several legislators, representatives from the municipalities and counties, and then also the executive branch, who then have good contacts with stakeholders across the state to come up with projects that meet these criteria. And as we talked about when we met in June, there were goals identified that were presented at that meeting. And I'll just walk you through those because this is somewhat significant, I think, for the way the governor's office views the relationship as we move forward with joint appropriations. And so there's the goals established, and what comes next is that there's teams working on these and trying to meet with members of the public and stakeholders to develop a proposal that would then come to the governor and then could ultimately come to the legislature in 2022 or 2023. And so they would be aimed towards these goals. And so that's why I just feel it's important for me to walk through these with you. And so if that's all right, I'll jump into these goals. So the first goal is very broad, but it's kind of a vision for, I think, what we're aiming for with these one-time investments. And again, that's another big factor here is that we're talking about one-time investments. And while it could be the American Rescue Plan dollars, or it could be general fund dollars that are available because of the American Rescue Plan, we do know that these are one-time in nature, so that we can't be funding ongoing projects. So that first goal that is about the quality of life here in Wyoming, and especially both attracting and retaining families and young adults so they'll raise families here in Wyoming. The second goal there it is very aligned with where the Business Council has been heading for a while, and it is really about strengthening the economy by both fortifying our existing industries and also growing new ones. So we'll have proposals in that area, and the Business Council is the lead on that particular goal. So the next goal here is a workforce goal, and the Department of Workforce Services is leading this, and it is very broad, but you know, we continue to know how important this is. We also know how important it is for the Department of Workforce Services to work with the Business Council and those sectors where we're trying to grow workforce and grow the economy, that they're very much in line. The next goal is something that we've worked on closely with the legislature over the last year or plus, and that is about Connect Wyoming and access to high-speed internet. So we think that some great progress in working closely with the broadband committee on this goal as well. And then there's a healthcare focus goal here, and this will feel like is an opportunity for the healthcare task force, which has already convened a lot of stakeholders from around the state, to be part of a discussion about it, how any one-time investments might strengthen any of the policy ideas or goals that task force has established. And then a goal about outdoor recreation and enhancing wildlife. And that's on the next one. So, this is kind of particular to
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we go back a sec, Rennie, to the mental health piece? And it's the only place I see a mention of our elderly population, which is a significant percentage. Are there discussions about other avenues to assist, as in keeping people in their homes, supporting senior centers, stuff like that?
Mr. Chairman. Yes, very much. This is the area where we would focus on that. The first part of your question about if we're trying to make any recommendations or proposals that involve that at-home care or dealing with the care for the elderly, it would come through this goal. And the task force has already established aging as one of the topics that it's focused on. In terms of the second part of that, of would that lead to something like new infrastructure and the building of centers or anything like that, that I think may also pop up in a later goal, and that would relate to communities. And so our community is interested in making that investment because, as we'll talk about, the municipalities have received their own funds and the counties have received their own funds. So I think we really want to find areas where we're going to align, and if we're going to be proposing to invest in those kind of facilities, that there would be a shared investment in it, and also a look at what is the future of that, because I know this is a passion of the governor. He is not interested in building something without a plan for how to make sure that that is maintained and staffed.
Thank you, Ren.
So again, outdoor recreation, enhancing that space, because that I think is so important, not only for growing the economy of Wyoming, but also because that's so important to the quality of life and the reason people live here and our identity, I think, as a state. The next goal is a look at the food supply and distribution in markets. So real focus on the agricultural industry in particular there, although that will also be happening in goal 2. But this will have some specific ideas around what we do, because one of the cracks that was exposed in the system last year was in food distribution for food banks. And so there is going to be a focus out of this one to look at that system to see if there's any fixes that we can make. The next goal about infrastructure is broad. I think it would be a big conversation between the executive branch and in particular this committee to discuss infrastructure projects that have been put off for a while, and can we offset those costs, because that is an investment that will keep taxes low for our children and into the future. If we can offset some of these costs that will otherwise require an investment in future years, and they're beneficial, obviously, because they stimulate the economy as well. And then we may have some discussions to go a little bit broader than that, if it's irrigation infrastructure or if it's energy infrastructure that again help fortify and grow the economy here. And then talked about this a little bit in June, but one of the things that has just come up over and over again is kind of another crack that was exposed last year, as we were also cutting $500 million from the budget is the challenge we're having right now with recruiting and retaining employees to meet the needs of the state. So we may have some proposals coming through that goal. And the efficiency and modernization, Director Hibbard has led the efficiency project and that fund that was established. Senator Perkins and Chairman Perkins, I know you played a large role in that, the establishment of that, but could we look at something similar again going forward, and also to look at those projects that are going to help us keep the state workforce, as we shed 300 plus positions over the last year, what can we do to keep the state workforce small and nimble, but also stay efficient and provide the services that are necessary. And then the last one gets to what I was talking to Representative Schwartz about, and that is, as we look at working with cities, counties, and tribal governments, as they have the same goal to thrive into the future, what is necessary as we look at these dollars for any sort of program to establish, if it's MRG-ish, something like that, that is a one-time investment, but again, helps the entire state thrive and finds some ways to leverage funds to do more going forward. So that's a rundown on these goals, Mr. Chairman. And if there's no questions, I'll turn it over to Ms. Legursky, who can take you through the other slides.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Rennie, thank you for that presentation. I like the on the drive and thrive. Obviously, his goals are laudable, and I like it that for criteria for funding, that the first one you've listed is have a long-term impact or return on investment. That's certainly a big concern. I think of myself, and I think other members in the committee, that when we spend these ARPA funds, we want them to have a long-term investment and not be white elephant projects. Could you address how these criteria and goals fit into the statutory requirements for ARPA? As I understand it, essentially, your categories are, the big category is revenue shortfall, which is about $500 million, we estimate. And then the other $500 million of this billion of our ARPA funds essentially needs to be spent on water, sewer, broadband, tourism, basically. So for these goals that are not water, sewer, broadband, or tourism, is it the proposal or the idea in concept that that's going to get paid for out of the revenue shortfall piece of the ARPA funds? Or is there some other plan?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. So a couple parts of that. First of all, the U.S. Treasury's rule this year, they did things a little bit differently. Last year for CARES Act, they just put out guidance and then would change it as they went. This year, they put out guidance and called it draft. And so the comment period just closed on that last week. And the governor issued some comments saying we need flexibility. So we do have some hope that there can be some added flexibility. I think the main crux of his comment to U.S. Treasury was each state has unique problems that were caused by COVID. And we need the ability to take those on without a one size fits all regulatory or at least guidance scheme from U.S. Treasury. So hopefully we get a little bit more flexibility as we go forward. But there are certainly, I think, a couple other opportunities. You mentioned the infrastructure part of it. There is some another opportunity to spend the ARPA, the other $500 million is on projects that help deal with the economic impacts that COVID caused. So I think we'd look at some of those qualifying here. But certainly I think part of this exercise that we've gone through in this planning has showed us that, you know, if we do have one-time dollars that are general fund because of ARPA, then maybe we that's how we would be looking at those as well. And the revenue picture is a little different right now. The governor certainly believes that the revenues that are coming in right now also likely are not sustainable. So any dollars that we kind of look at spending over the next couple of years seem to be one-time in nature. So I think both of those parts go into this equation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Rennie, and certainly we'll hope for as much flexibility as possible. I have a kind of a process question. Maybe it's just not just for you, but also for the committee, and we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, is that if there are specific ideas, what's the best way to get that vetted? So to take just a hypothetical example, ambulance service in rural areas is a challenge in parts of our state. And one potential use of funds as a one-time funds would be to say, hey, if you have a private ambulance service that's not doing very well, that maybe the local fire department or municipality or hospital could take it over, but there'd be one-time costs associated with that. And, you know, maybe ARPA funds, we could find a pigeonhole to make that eligible. And you might say, okay, you need X dollars for that, whatever that is. Process-wise, what's the process for taking an idea like that and trying to sort out whether that's a good idea or a bad idea? And whether that gets turned into legislation or appropriation. So kind of a broad-based process question.
Mr. Chairman, are you all right if I give the executive branch answer to that? So thank you. Right now, because of the governor's strike team, that we really do believe we have a process for that. And that is, we've got a lead on the healthcare goal. So we'll just stay with your example, Representative Stith, and that is ambulance service. Absolutely, we recognize that as a need. The healthcare task force is already discussing it. So we'd ask that anybody who is thinking of an idea in that space come to us, and we can get them referred to the entity that's working in that topic, and they can vet it and compare it to other proposals that are coming in. And so that's what we would do right now in this interim before the legislature gets here. And obviously the other thing, Representative Wilson, Chairman Wilson is on that task force as well. So I think if it needs to go into joint labor, she may take it in that direction. So we hope that we can work well together on these things. You know, the Connect Wyoming from last year was a huge example of where the legislative branch was working on a concept and could kind of outline a program, and then we could implement it even before the session came because of the authorization for new programs that was stood up. In this case, we don't need to act that quickly, but we can work together and shape proposals.
So I think, just to kind of wrap that up, the strike, I'm on that strike force team, and we have there's a health group component of it, and they are considering and had discussions about ambulance services as one of the topics to be evaluated. And so that strike force will probably put recommendations together. I'm guessing probably October. But before, you know, it kind of shakes out on the recommendations of each group. And we meet about every 2 weeks. In addition to that, obviously, either you individually or this committee or the labor committee can bring bills that will address that. And we will then, even more importantly, this committee during JAC in December and January will basically be the construct that will evaluate all of the proposals through the budgetary process and have the ability to influence or direct funds for particular projects or issues. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Erica Ligursky, Senior Policy Advisor for Governor Gordon. If you'd like, what I can do right now is go over the ARPA funding that went to the cities, towns, and counties. It was actually some pass-through funding that the state got that they passed along. There was some money that went to counties. They got their money directly from the federal government. And then also metropolitan cities, which included Casper and Cheyenne, got money directly. The other 97 municipalities, the money came to the governor's office. This first tranche of money that they got was roughly around 23.9 million. And we had 30 days to get that money out to those 97 entities. So it was kind of a big task. In that, I'd like to take this opportunity. The state auditor's office and the state budget department were instrumental in helping us with this project. Also, Rory Horsley and her team with A&I, along with Justin Schilling at the Wyoming Association of Municipalities, did long hours and hard work assisting some of these municipalities with the paperwork that they had to turn in, and then also making sure that we had all of the proper documentation to distribute those funds. So I wanted to thank them for that. It was a huge lift. In the first 30 days, we did get out 78 payments to those 97 entities, and that is shown. I'll kind of go to the next slide here. You can see on this slide, it shows just a breakdown of all of the cities and towns that got that money. So of the 78 entities that we paid, it was roughly 22.4 million that we got out. Those entities will have to spend that money the same way that the state has to spend our money. So the state auditor's office, the state budget division, and also the municipality has been working with some of those local entities, having meetings just to ensure that they know how they can spend those funds. And then we're also going to be helping them with the reporting process as well. We do have a report that's due August 31st, but then each of those municipalities will have a report that they have to have due on August 30, or excuse me, October 31st.
And
So-
Erica, remind us what those restrictions are.
So it's the same restrictions that Representative Stith had just mentioned, where you have to do, there is some revenue reserve. There's the water sewer aspect. So it's all those same restrictions that we had that Representative Stith mentioned.
So the four cities that or towns that did not want it, do we know why they didn't want it? Just because it was a hassle, that it wasn't worth the cost to them? I mean, I think that Elk Mountain wouldn't pass up $16,000. Maybe they did, so.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know the reason for all of those, but I do know for the town of Lost Springs, $346 is what they were going to get. I think they, said that they were fine and didn't need that money. So as you can see, there's 15 cities and towns that we did not pay yet. We did get a 30-day extension. So we'll have the month of July to get those payments out to them. And again, we're working really hard with those to get that. A lot of it has to do with the verification of their DUNS number at the federal government level. Some of those entities didn't have a DUNS number. So just getting them set up and making sure that they're in good standing with the federal government before we can make those payments. That's one of the restrictions. Most of those are going really well. It is more of just a timing issue of when they did that and then when they're showing in the system. So we'll get those out. And then you had mentioned there are 4 entities that have declined the funds: Bear Oil, Elk Mountain, Lost Springs, and Riverside. Those entities still have to do some paperwork to say that they're going to decline those funds. So even though they've declined them, they'll still have to do that reporting in October, saying that they've declined those funds. And then it is a small amount, roughly 30,000, that will get redeployed amongst the other, 94 entities that we had there. So that was just kind of it. We just wanted to let you know on here what we had given out and then what we had left remaining. And so I think we're in pretty good standing with those cities, towns, and making sure that they have their funding. And like we alluded to, the municipalities, along with the state auditor's office, are going to be doing some help with those entities to make sure that they have the reporting requirements that they need. Mr. Chairman, if there's no questions on that, I can talk about the FEMA cost recovery.
Go ahead.
It's just a quick one, Erica. I don't see Rollins on.
They are on, they're one of the
I got
15. Yep. Mr. Chairman, on this slide, this alludes to the question that you had regarding our FEMA recovery. It's going well. We are on track. The timetables that they have set up, we have weekly meetings with FEMA with Hagerty to go over this FEMA request. They have also had Hagerty, along with the Office of Homeland Security, has had meetings with FEMA Region 8 to discuss some request for information on the first set of money that we had given out, which was the testing kits for the communities. There has been a little bit of back and forth on that regarding what dollar figure they're going to pay for those. They have a cap of roughly $100. We have paid about $125 for those testing kits. So there's been a lot of back and forth conversations. Is that a hard cap, or can we justify that there was the proper due diligence to make those payments? It sounds like those discussions have gone pretty well. We won't know the final decision on that yet until it has to go up another level. FEMA Region 8 will submit that up another level, and they'll make the final decisions on whether that is reimbursable or not. It goes to the Consolidated Resource Center. But all indications are that is moving forward well. So that is that first tranche of the 27 to 41 million is what we projected in there.
So just with regards to that, you had a meeting on the 9th.
Mhm.
And that's, what do you anticipate timing wise that we'll get a decision on how much of that they'll refund? And then when they do it, how quickly does the refund dollars arrive?
Mr. Chairman, they haven't given us an ETA on that. Have you heard that, Kevin? I didn't hear on the last call where there was an ETA for that funding, but for the indications, they said that we were on track with what we've laid out.
Mr. Chairman, Kevin Hibbert, Director of State Budget Department. We have been meeting with them and they are now in the process of getting the final negotiations with the FEMA and the steps that we have to go through FEMA. We're positive that we are going to be actionable on this first tranche, $41 million. There is the challenge on their expectation of what we paid for a testing kit and what their total amount is. But we took into consideration transportation, Wyoming being a rural state and things like that in order to work that. We believe that we should have some knowledge of that this month. And with that knowledge, it won't take us very long at all to turn that money around. We will certainly be working with the state auditor's office at that point in time to make sure that we don't get in front of the horse, you know, but we can turn it around very quickly. And then once we get through this, the first step, the next step should be a little more routine than the first discussion. But I think that this is the largest FEMA-related situation that Wyoming has ever conducted. And that's good news for us. And we are doing everything we can for every single dollar that we can find and get it into the back end of the COVID bucket, so to speak, so that we can go ahead and finish up with those COVID-related topics that we have.
And so if we, let's assume sometime in September, we receive 41 million bucks, that has to be expended by the end of the year under the extended guidelines, correct? And so then basically those are really the dollars that we're talking about, that 60 million that we talked about earlier. Is that right?
Yes,
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Yes, and we're positioned to do that quickly and also to track all the other projects to see that they get expended as well. So expect us to be very busy, say late October, early November, so that we can make sure that every single dollar is leveraged.
Okay.
Mr.
Please
Chairman.
proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, that is one of the things that we have talked to. It's kind of out of our control for that timing, but that is one of the things that we've stressed to Haggerty and the consulting team was that we need that funding as soon as possible, preferably September, if we could get that, just so that we could do what you alluded to that, those UI payments that are coming.
How are we paying Haggerty?
Haggerty is being paid through FEMA reimbursement funding, so they'll get a portion of that. They can use the funding that they recapture for that payment. On the front end, we have used a small amount of CARES money to do that initial contract with them.
So do they collect a percentage of what they collect, or is it what? I just curious what the contract is or how it works.
Mr. Chairman, I can get you the details of that contract. I'm not sure off the top of my head on that.
Mr. Chairman, they're paid on services provided. They don't get a direct percentage of that fine.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
For project number 2, that's one that is well underway. So for the Department of Health is working with Haggerty also. They have the projects that they do that they compile together. This is for the testing and services. They will give that to the Wyoming Office of Homeland Security, who will review that draft. Once those 3 entities agree on that draft, then they will send that to FEMA Region 8. So that'll be the similar project process to what happened in number 1. So that is on track for that application coming out. Last week is when Department of Health was supposed to get that to the Office of Homeland Security. They'll review that. So we should have an update this week as to when that will be transferred forward to FEMA. On that, the deadline to get that to FEMA is on 7/16. So we'll have a meeting this week to see if that went out. Number 3 that is on track is to get that money and information to Haggerty by 7/23. And that's going to be for the testing kits that went to the at-home individuals. So that may have some of the same conversations that we're in with number 1 as far as that cap, but we think we have some good headway and some good reasonings for the amounts that we paid on there. If there's no questions on that, I think I'll turn it back over to Rennie, or we can just open it up for general questions.
On the total number of identified is 112 million. So that's the first, that's the before it was always 60 to 100 or something like that. So how comfortably are we with that number? And what in terms of what's realistic or
Mr. Chairman, I think that in the conversations that we've had with Hagerty, there's that amount submitted to FEMA, and it's the 81 to the 104. So that is where more of the comfort level is on that, is between that range.
All right. Anything else for Eric? All right, what's next?
Mr. Chairman, this is again Kevin Hibbard. I'm the Director of the State Budget Department. Today, I'm here to discuss with you the process that we've designed and implemented for the financial activity associated with ARPA. So I'm going to attempt to share a screen. So, Mr. Chairman, in June, I provided to you a at-a-glance status of funds for ARPA, and we provided that updated spreadsheet to you, and I can walk through that as well as we progress. What I meant in June by at a glance was really we were targeting what was the unauthorized, unappropriated portion available in ARPA dollars. And Representative Stiff, you talked about a little bit of this earlier as well. So I just wanted to kind of walk through that, because I think the at a glance aspect of this is the unobligated amount that you're seeing in both the status of funds and also in this bubble diagram. So the unallocated amount for overall ARPA, you'll have to add the two tranches together. It's about $534 million. But what we're looking at here really is that we want to be able to talk about ARPA in its entirety, but also talk about it in tranches. I think the important aspect of this is tranches. You heard Director McKay say earlier that we've got the first 534 million. We anticipate the second 534, but there's no assurity as as this progresses what we're actually going to get. So when we have it in hand, we will have those conversations. So the governor did accept the State Budget Department's recommendation to put into two tranches the ARPA dollars. So on the very first glance, if you take a look at the bubble sheet that I'm showing you here today, is we've got $1,068,485,232. That's what we received in the authorization. So we tranched that into two separate tranches, dividing it in half like the Treasury did. The Treasury did give us the first distribution of $534,242,616, which we have acted upon. The most important actions that have taken place on that particular pot of money would be the fact that we took $300 million and set it aside so that we could go out and get the revenue assistance portion of ARPA collected. And of that $300 million, we've got $121 million out of corrections that we did. We worked on that in June. The Department of Corrections was great. They worked with us, the State Auditor's Office. This was not an easy task, but it's completed. That $121 million that I'm talking about, it's actually 129,65,987.66. That is in the general fund. It never left the general fund. That is going to be on the profile for the legislature, as Rennie discussed earlier, and you discussed, Representatives, that adds the money available to the state of Wyoming in general fund dollars. So what we try to do is kind of break this down into in these two tranches. So I'll just walk through this again. This is not, this is a little bit complicated. There's some strange moving parts going on. But first of all, we got the 1.68 billion. We split that into the tranches. The first tranche we received, the 534, we've got that money now. We took $300 million and set that aside to target that for revenue reimbursement. Of that $300 million, we have already changed $120.9 million of that's done. As soon as we cut the B11, stood it up in the Wolves accounting system, the governor signed it. That money is now in the general fund, and that's where it will remain until the legislature appropriates that in the upcoming process. Now, certainly the governor can make recommendations in his budget against that profile. Legislature then can go put it on their golden rod, but that $120 million is real. In the B11 that we sent over for the 10-day waiting period, by the way, everything that we're doing with ARPA is going to go through the 10-day waiting cycle. We didn't do that with CARES because we have a limited amount of time. You heard Director McKay say, hey, we're going to do this properly with the time that's necessary for us to do this. So in this case, we put that B11 for corrections and also the $300 million through the 10-day waiting cycle and expect all ARPA B11 associated dollars going through the 10-day waiting cycle or get appropriated through the budget itself. So
Kevin, just sorry to interrupt, but on the Department of Corrections, the 120 million, 121, is that for fiscal year 2021? What's the bracket?
Mr. Chairman, that is fiscal year 2022, the fiscal year that we started July 1st of this year. That's why we had to get at it. And we did. And that money has been converted. And it resides in the general fund and will be profiled to the governor's profile. And also when the legislature does their profile in January, you'll also have that. Now, the next step of that $300 million is what I want to talk about. Because in that B11 that we had the 10-day waiting cycle on, we talked about the legislature's assistance. And that assistance would be for us to have legislation that's necessary to intercept YDOT's unrestricted highway funds or their royalties and severance taxes. That requires statute. We did that with AML money. We've done that several times using YDOT as the tool in order for us to do that. In ARPA, it says roads, like it did public safety for corrections. So if we do corrections fiscal year 2022, like we just did, we do corrections for the 23-24 biennium, which we would plan to do as well. That'd be $265 million more. And then we can do about $48 million a year from YDOT's royalties and severance taxes. That gets us up to $511 million that we can change money into the revenue reimbursements and set it aside for the legislature as general fund dollars. We are exploring other alternatives. Those other alternatives that we're exploring right now is CAPCOM projects. And we actually looked at the school facility projects as well. But we're not going to chase the school facility projects because of the MOE entanglement that we'd be faced. If we use this money on the state capital construction side, it'd be just like corrections. We're looking for easy ways to do this because you have audit things that'll jump up and bite you. For example, if we use it in Department of Health and we were using it for matching federal dollars, matching federal funds with federal funds. So that basically says, you know, if you got the big five, you have corrections left because the Department of Family Services is the same way. We have entanglements with the statewide cost allocation we talked about last June that would put us into a situation where we wouldn't have a clean and clear methodology of doing that. So we looked at the clean and clear methodologies. Corrections doesn't have a statewide cost allocation. Corrections has $40,000 of federal funds that is not matched. And then if we funded the state CAPCON, or more importantly, if we get the statutory language to intercept YDOT's unrestricted highway funds or those federal mineral royalties and severance taxes, we can then convert full 502 million. Now look at this chart, you'll see that there's the other tranche. There's tranche one, which we just talked about, and there's tranche two. The governor has already authorized that a tranche two, the $202 million to do the revenue conversion. That adds up to the 502 that we calculated for revenue assistance. We chose to put it in two separate tranches. Go ahead.
That brought up a question to me, Kevin, that I didn't understand because I thought I heard you say a little bit ago, the 534 in tranche two isn't, we're assuming that will happen, but it's not chiseled in stone. And so the 202 in that revenue shortfall, was there a possibility that we could have put that in tranche one along with the 300? Or does that come at a different time frame?
Mr. Chairman, you could do that. The legislature could say, when we get into December, say we're going to put this all in a single tranche and go after the $502 million in tranche one. But tranche two, we set it up for two reasons. Okay, first of all, we're not sure of the amount that we're going to get out of tranche two from the feds. We believe we're going to get it. Their satisfaction, you know, we'll have that. The other thing is that if we use the mechanisms that we just discussed with converting corrections already that we've done, it's done. And then we look at their budget for 23, 24, and then we look at the intercepting whiteout funds. We have the life of ARPA to convert to full 502 million. But one of the risks would be is converting the $502 million and not have anything for the legislature other than the 502, which comes back to you anyway. Because what happened if they didn't give us tranche two? Or any other things that could probably happen through any of the guidance that we like to have now that we don't. Because we want to be very careful. We want to get the full guidance that we can from the Treasurer's office so we can move forward on this. So we're actionable, but we've tranched it.
And so when you reference want to leave some there for the legislature to use, Kevin. So is there maybe two approaches to that? That if you take it all, it goes to general fund, then the legislature does have full control of it? Or you can do it as you lined out, that you got in two tranches, then you have this unallocated ARPA funds available that that are designated ARPA funds, and then the executive and legislative branch work to allocate that out according to guidance from the Treasury. Is that a fair thought process, or am I screwed up here?
Mr. Chairman, through the collaboration of the governor's office and through the legislature, all the ARPA funds will be administered. You know, I don't want to pick, you know, the size on it. But what we've done right now is we wanted to get the process started to get the actual revenue assistance back to us, which we've had. We have $121 million of that, basically, with corrections. And then there may be things that you want to have more higher level of immediacy associated with from the 534 that we have in hand. So let's say we get the full 300 converted between now and December, and then you'll have $233 million that could be for fast acting situations without having to wait for the second tranche. So we're just trying to get things laid out in a methodology so we can move in an orderly fashion. So one of the examples would be is going through the process was important to get corrections through. Pick one, I don't care. But getting through the process of this so that we can actually have the revenue relief, that was important, and we have achieved that. So we still have the difference between the 120 million and the $300 million to convert, and we'd like to keep it simple. We think we can do $60 million with Capcom this time because it was appropriated after March 3rd. That still requires us to work with WIDOT in intercepting their funds, which puts us into the next biennium regardless. So tranching it makes a little bit of sense in the fact of the timing of the money.
So explain to me in a little more detail the 60 million on Capcom. You're referring to the projects that we approved.
Correct. The 12 million for UW and the 12 million for community colleges be $24 million. Of that.
So are you then swapping for those dollars as well?
We're considering that right now. We've got to go through all the tests, but we started the process of looking about what's next one we can do that is clean for us to do the revenue look back on, and that's the next project.
Go ahead.
So I understand that the first goal on the first tranche, 300 million, we've got basically 120 million.
Correct. Out of tranche one. So we still haven't even completed the converting the tranche one yet. And we do want to recommend strongly that we intercept WIDOT's federal minimum wage service taxes.
And so from my understanding from your, one of the ideas behind tranching is you're breaking this up a bit more lights. Which dealt with the first tranche. and since it doesn't come from the year, we've got. Yeah.
That's correct. So let's use YDOT for an example. So it would impact tranche 1 and tranche 2. Because we would use it for a portion of the 300 million in tranche 1, and we could use it for a portion of the $202 million in tranche 2.
And Mr. Chairman, good. And all you're doing, you're talking about legislative involvement, you're talking about the same type of legislation. I think we're section 300 thing in the budget. Very similar to that. That's
Correct. Correct. But the driving force behind all this is to be clean, to where we don't find ourselves getting snared into paying something back. YDOT's clean, corrections is clean, the state construction portion that's not associated with the school facilities because of MOE, that's clean. We want to look at clean ways and make sure that we achieve the full 502 million.
What's the number that we can capture for YDOT?
The number that I received here recently was about $48 million a year.
Per year.
And I asked that question to YDOT a couple of weeks ago. And I can share that spreadsheet, or I can have them share that spreadsheet with also staff. So basically, at this point in time, if we have to test cap, make sure that we're not matching it in some strange way, like the community colleges. If you get federal funds matched on it, then you find out later you're not going to be happy with us. So we're going to go through that process, and that's 60. So that puts us up to about $571 million that we can move on and get this. Now, one of the things that I did write in the B11 that you saw when we sent it over to LSO for the 10-day waiting cycle, when we write the legislation that's associated with YDOT, what we want to say is something to the effect up to the amount necessary to, because corrections may not, we took their general funds, but they've got to spend it. We've taken it, but we still got to spend it. And I think that corrections budget is going to get fully expended. But we want to make sure that we have that latitude with the YDOT portion up to the amount necessary to. And that helps us with making sure that we can clean up the pieces like we'll be doing with CARES this October, November, make sure that we have 100% of the mission completed.
And we're still in this situation that for the what you call revenue shortfall allocation, we're still targeting 510 million roughly after that, with the likelihood that we won't qualify after that. Is that still?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the calculated amount is 502 million and change. So that's what we were using this conversation on today. That does not include the permissible amount that we can find through the budget process that we do through this upcoming session. And we've talked about that in the budget process. We have we have established new revenue codes and new revenue items inside the IBAR so that we can say, was this a calculated amount, corrections, or was this a permissible amount, the lab in the Department of Health? We think there's another $20 million on top of the 502 with the permissible amount. But the permissible amount calculates itself, right? It doesn't have to go through the methodology of corrections that we apply.
Go ahead.
So if I've got the numbers right, where you're at right now, we've got $3 million a year for YDOT. So we get 3 years, 2 years to 4 years out of that. 4 years out of YDOT, so there's 200 million. You've got another. You've got 121 in corrections.
265. 265.
265. So with those things, where we've got it covered.
Yeah, without the
We're over the 5.
right, we're at 511 without doing CapCon. We do CapCon and it all goes through, and we're at 571. So we got plenty of push, but it's going to take us more than a single budget cycle to do this. But the mission is important too, and we do show the IBARs that you'll be able to see this clearly, how that function works inside of IBARs.
At what point will we know, will you have a comfort zone with the 60 million for the CapCon?
This week, hopefully. We're in the process of doing that right now. We just didn't get the revenue test done. We went through and we looked at all, and we looked at school facilities and we looked at the state COPCOM, we got it all totaled up. But what takes place is you have the MOE situation with school facilities. So we don't want to do that because we just, it just adds to the MOE tolerance. But with corrections and doing state CAPCON, that puts us in a better favor for the MOE on our side. Because if you change that revenue assistance, that is looked at as like a budget reduction on the state side of the MOE formula. So we don't want to go infuriate, maybe that's a poor selection of word. We don't want to create a situation by transacting against the school facilities budget that puts us in further harm's way with the MOE calculation.
Thank you. Kevin, it seems to me, and I appreciate the conversation on the MOE, and we see that in some of the programs of the Department of Health, but it seems like we would have a situation at the state hospital be similar to the corrections, where that's state funded and there's really not an MOE. Was there any opportunity there to, and that's not a Medicaid reimbursement, it's just basically general funds. Was there any possibility there?
Mr. Chairman, if I'm understanding you correct, is there any opportunity to be able to use the Department of Health for the revenue look back or the revenue assistance? It's very complicated, very challenging, and we don't want to do something that makes us pay it back later on because you have all those things, but most primarily the matching federal dollars with federal dollars. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to chase the permissible side on the Department of Health, which we will do.
But, Mr. Chairman, thank you. But I guess that was the reason I singled out the state hospital, because there aren't federal dollars there. It really seems to me to be somewhat similar to corrections, where we're using those general funds for that adult populations that have mental illness. I was just curious if that conversation come up, because that's kind of a unique beast in that department.
Mr. Chairman, there are entanglements on the state hospital with the funding. And it's Fund 301, the Department of Health moving money inside their own budget that creates that entanglement.
Okay, any other questions? Anything else, Kevin?
So, Mr. Chairman,
Keep it going.
I just wanted to let you know that today I wanted to talk to you about the process, and I think for this particular sheet, in just a bubble fashion, does this. It's understandable that it's going to take 2 or 3 iterations of this conversation for everybody to have a full understanding of how the process is working. But I've given you the supporting documentation as well. So you have the status of funds, which is at a glance, what you have available. And it's important for us to say 233,994,516 out of tranche 1. And the tranche 2 is 331,46,484. I've also given you the spreadsheet that's associated with the tracking of how we do the revenue assistance. You'll see on that spreadsheet that the Department of Corrections is populated there. And that's the only one that's populated there because that's the only one that we've conducted. And that was the 120,965,987.66. And also, Mr. Chairman, I've given you the detail associated with where the money is gone so far out of the 534 million, or even the 1.68 million. $248,100 for the department, state budget department. We're looking for a couple of AWAC positions and some software development. The governor's office for implementation of ARPA that's pending for $40,000, and the $300 million that we just discussed. That's associated with the revenue look back portion to the 502 total calculated amount. But I don't have any intentions of pulling those slides up and showing them. It's just really too busy and too small.
Going back to the CAPCOM component of it. My question then is, if we can use the ARPA dollars as directed in the legislation that we've had, and if those dollars are available, is that something then that can be implemented between now and session?
Mr. Chairman, with the platform that we have now, we're not taking any of the revenue assistance money and reallocating it. we're waiting for the session. Can leadership in the governor's office have a conversation about how ARPA would be in the best interest to use it earlier in some fashion? Yes. There's still the fact of the matter is that if there's something out there like I spoke of in ARPA with the $233 million that seems to be the right thing to do, yes. The direct funding is still available in a program that's already established, for example. But the priority is to get the CARES money through first. I just shot a rough estimate. I did a summary on it, and it was $60 million that I had on state cap. 24 of that is higher education. The rest of it is for the expanse of state government. But what we need to do now is to check to see if somebody is using federal dollars as a way to meet the matching expectations, or maybe there's not even a matching expectation. Maybe they're just doing more to the project than was originally funded. I mean, there's just things that we have to check on to make sure that we don't find out 6 years from now, oh, you shouldn't have done this, pay us back.
Which means that they need to be educated on how to go about what they're doing as well, because they can define the dollars now that will benefit them going forward. So I presume that's something that we need to do.
Mr. Chairman, and that brings up a great point. One of the features that we've decided that we will have inside of our RFP when it's released, and it should be released shortly, for consultant assistance on ARPA, is an educational feature of ARPA provided by the consultants, or maybe it's provided by the state budget department and the governor's policy office. But not just for us, the local governments as well. They have this money through the NEU distribution that they're going to have to do reporting on. So we are thinking about our partners in this as well, as making sure that they have that educational opportunity. And then also, I think the 10-day waiting period for the B11s. Let's say, for example, we choose the 60 million. We'll put it on a B11. We'll say how it's going to be conducted. We'll send it over to LSO. LSO will have a chance to look at it, and so will you in that 10-day waiting cycle.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, that's a wrap for me.
Are there any questions, or you want Kevin to go back to any of the slides he has presented to us? Go ahead, Senator Grew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Everett, on these funds that on this sheet that you've given us, that you got up on the board, what are the variables? I mean, this is the best guess right now based on the best information you have. You know, it's just kind of like the FEMA. We've been talking about the FEMA money with the CARES Act. What are there variables out here that you're looking at that might change this between now and the time we hit session? And if so, what are they? What are the things that we're still waiting on, or things that are a little less baked with regards to guidance, with regards to how we're approaching this?
Mr. Chairman, I'm confident the way that what we've done so far is in good standing with the guidance that we receive from the Treasury. I don't expect to see any challenges on what we've discussed today. But that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be future challenges predicated on future guidance, or the fact that we want to be careful when we start talking about what we choose to use for the revenue look back for state CapCom, for example.
If I follow up. Thank you. Kevin, you talked about too, and the co-chair, Mr. Co-chairman brought this up about, seems to me very important to get this out to all the players downstream as far as how to use this money and not to mix federal money, especially in the departments. You talked about having that with the consultant, the RFP. What's the time frame on that?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that we be tying up the loose ends on the RFP this week, Erica. And then that would probably go through the AG's office, and that'll be a week, maybe 2. And then once that approval has been provided to us, then we would release that to the street for vendors to apply to assist us.
Mr. Chairman, between now and then, has there been some sort of send out to the entities involved, whether it be the community colleges, some of those other folks, to kind of highlight that, hang on, be careful, just, maybe before you look, before you spend?
Yes, so Mr. Chairman, we did
Memo.
not yet communicate to the community colleges on looking at the CapCon. We are in process of doing that. We held back intentionally until we did our check first. We do have a shared document that once that our check has, we verify that, we will turn it over to the community colleges for them to check as well. And we will provide them guidance of what we want them to say yes or no to, and it'll be in the document. Did you use any type of federal funds in this project? Would be a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, any other questions for Kevin? All right, appreciate it, Kevin.
Thank you.
Good work. So where does that take us on our list? Are we ready for Robin?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Sure. Before Robin jumps in, is there any public comment on anything we've discussed so far this morning? Seeing none, we will proceed. Robin, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for having us here this morning. My name is Robin Cooley, and I'm the Director of Wyoming Workforce Services. I have with me here today at the table Holly McCamey-Simone, who is our Workforce Programs Administrator. I also believe we have on the line, just in case we get really deep down into the weeds with some of this unemployment information, Chris Funk, who is our UI Administrator. And also, if we get into the weeds with workers' compensation, I have Jason Wolf here, who is our Workforce Programs Administrator as well. We understand you've had some additional questions as it relates to unemployment compensation, not only the funding that we have received from CARES Act, but also the calculation of the tax rate. And so we'd like to start off first giving you some information related to the solvency of the trust fund and how we sit in regard to other states, but also how we calculate tax rates, a quick overview of that. And then we'll go into how we have utilized the CARES Act funds and some proposals into the future. With that, I'll turn it over to Ms. McCamey-Simone. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm going to get us started here with some visual graphs. Hopefully that comes up soon. Next slide, please. So the first slide here shows information on our unemployment claims, and this graph encompasses February 2019 through April 2021 and shows the number of paid unemployment claims by month. The black colored bars here represent the time period from February 19 through April 20. And then the brown colored bars represent the time period from February 20 to April 2021. And it's showing a comparison of the month in each year. You can see that our peak claims were in May of 2020 with the highest number of claims, a little over 111,000. And then if we look at April 2019, pre-COVID, you'll see we had about 12,473 monthly claims. April 2020, 75,555. And then April 2021, we were lower again, but back down to about 26,870. Next slide, please. Here you can see.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine.
What would be customary? Because, I mean, if you look at the black for 2020, it looks like it's averaging between 10,000 to 20,000 on average. Is that fair? And is that customary over 2017?
Yeah, it runs around between 10,000 to 15,000 a month. That's correct. Yeah, in a typical year.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Simone, thank you. To be clear, so for say May of 2020, which appears to be the peak month, 111,000 claims, when the unemployment rate was at about 8.5%.
Correct.
That's the number of claims for a typically unemployed individual in say May of 2020. Are they making a claim every week? So are they potentially accounting for as many as 5 claims in that 110,000, 111,000?
Yes, that could be more than one claim, especially if they're on more than one program. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, just because the number struck me as extraordinarily high, given that the whole workforce is 263,000 people, to have 111,000 unemployment claims in 1 month is truly extraordinary. But I take it that if I just have one job and I lose my one job and I apply for unemployment in May of 2020, will I show up as one claim or will I show up as 4 claims or 5 claims for each week of the month?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Smith, in this example, that is all the claims that our unit received that month. So it could be one person has a claim, but it's in multiple programs. Did that answer your question?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So you're saying it's not just unemployment, it's if I'm applying for some other kind of benefit?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Smith, no, it is only for unemployment. There are different federal unemployment programs that they could be eligible for and could have claims for.
How common is it that you have one person apply for 2 or 3 different programs?
That was fairly common, Mr. Chairman, during the pandemic, because they could be on a program such as the PUA program and also get the federal pandemic unemployment, that additional.
So going back to what the representative was getting at, if you look at that high mark of 111,000, that could be just 70,000 people, individuals, right?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. That is not people, that is claims per month that is shown on this graph.
Do you have a people's number?
I can get you that, Mr. Chairman.
Just out of curiosity, how many hard bodies are there versus would be interesting?
Yeah,
All right.
And
of course, we
Thank
can
you.
get you that.
And Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
as a follow-up, I take it roughly speaking, if you had 8.5% unemployment in May, that'd be out of 260,000, that'd be 22,000 individuals. That was my kind of question of how do you have 22,000 individuals generate 111,000 claims? That's kind of my, I think you tried to answer that and I probably haven't understood it that well.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Smith. I don't have those numbers in front of me, but yes, I would agree with that roughly.
Go ahead.
So does the department have a way to track distinct applicants? So is that how you get, which is how you get to that number, I'm assuming?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator Perkins, every claimant has to file individually for their claims, and they have to do that each week. And so we definitely can track individuals and people.
Is it, Mr. Chairman, is that a manual process, or are you able to track that through your existing system?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Perkins, we have a very modernized UI system, and so most of our folks are able to apply online. And then our workforce centers stayed open throughout the pandemic. We were able to assist them in our workforce centers if they needed assistance with that manually.
So, Mr. Chairman, do claimants then have a distinct ID number of some sort that is always their ID number when they're applying for it?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Perkins, that is correct, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Here you can see Wyoming's unemployment rate as compared to the national unemployment rate from February 2020 through May 21. Our Wyoming's highest unemployment rate was in May of 2020 at 8.5% as compared to the national unemployment rate of 14.8%. You can see it declined somewhat, and the unemployment rate in Wyoming has been stable for the past several months, down considerably from a year ago, which was 7.4%. We are currently sitting at 5.4%, which is closer to the national average.
Go ahead.
So Holly, we're hearing back on our community is just a plea for people to work. We're in the 5.4% is still a little higher than probably what we've seen it in the past. Have you guys been able to do any research or anything that would explain if jobs are available, what the disconnect is on the elevation of unemployment rate yet against the needs of workforce?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, we've heard a number of different reasons from claimants about why, they're seeking work and having difficulty finding that, but we don't have any hard data on that right now. We're continuing to look at that and try to research that.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. And so if I may, so you've reached out to claimants. Do you also reach out to the industries? Because they're the ones at least that I'm hearing from, that saying, boy, we're just really having a difficult time. And it's not just in any one sector. It seems to be expanding on a monthly basis on who's needing help and can't even get applicants. And so
Yes.
I'm just curious, because you guys do a very thorough job at looking at that kind of stuff. I was just wondering if you had anything that revealed the mystery.
Yeah, we've heard rumors that basically there just aren't as many people in the workforce, that they're just not actively seeking work, or they've left the state, one or the other. I mean, do you have any data on that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's what's happening nationwide. So we've been talking with our national association along those lines about what data can we be looking at to determine, are people leaving the state? Are they getting different jobs? Are they not? For instance, hospitality and tourism, travel across Wyoming, there are openings across Wyoming in those areas. We are uncertain what's happening. We don't know what data to pull in order to determine what the factors are that are preventing filling those positions. So we're talking to everyone we can, including industry and claimants, but we're not certain right now. And quite honestly, we may not be until we're a little bit further down the road and some of that data starts coming in that we could start pulling and comparing.
Representative Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm curious, do you break down these numbers by business sectors, counties, things like that? I'll stick with counties. Let's start there.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, yes, I believe we could break that down. We don't have that with us today, but we could get you that.
A good example that we talked about last night is that numerous restaurants in Jackson are not open because they don't have a sufficient staff to operate, full time and stay open all the time. If they had obviously, if they've got plenty of people to feed, but they just don't have the personnel, and it's just kind of a unique situation. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, next slide, please. The next couple of slides are going to give you some information on the Wyoming Trust Fund as compared to the trust funds of other states across the nation. You can see here that our Wyoming UI Trust Fund is solvent, and we are ranked second in the nation for solvency.
So I'm curious, because if you look at this design, this graph, you think we'd be ranked second. So how do we get to seventh?
Second.
Yeah.
I did say second.
Oh, okay.
Apologies. If I
And
didn't.
I'm glad to know my hearing's not the only one.
And is that as a result of the additional capital we put into it with CARES Act dollars?
That's one, Mr. Chairman, that's one piece of the equation. There is a formula that we're going to get into that talks about how the trust fund works and what our tax rates are, how our tax rates are calculated.
Okay. Go ahead.
So I'd make the assumption that all states do it just a little bit different. And I think this would lend credibility, if I'm correct, that the formula that the agency uses to determine unemployment tax rates has worked and is keeping the fund solvent. Would that be fair?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that is correct, yes.
So under this graph, it looks like a third of the states are insolvent. Is
Mr.
that
Chairman, that is correct, yes. So there are only 12 states reflected on this chart the Department of Labor considers solvent, and that visual representation here is that thin gray vertical line, and that's the point of solvency at 1.0. Currently, 24 states are below the recommended solvency level, and there are 18 that are on a Title 12 advance and borrowing from the federal government to pay their UI benefits.
And is that unique because of COVID, or is this graph consistent over time?
Mr. Chairman, typically you wouldn't see this extreme on the graph. It would be a little more even and balanced, but therefore, so COVID has had a huge impact on some states more than others.
Mr. Chairman? Yeah. Oh, thank you. Just on this graph, if you look at this graph, this is the final high cost multiple as of 1/1/2021. I don't know exactly what the high cost multiple is. I'm assuming that's an actuarial calculation determination. But as I look at that, 1/1/21, does this take into consideration the fund building assessment that was sent out to all Wyoming employers? Is that taken into consideration in computing this rate of this high degree of solvency that the state enjoys right now?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Perkins, I don't know that I have the answer to that.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Perkins, I think that the non-charge that you're talking about, was that what you're referring to?
Well, no, I think when the new UI bills came out, non-insurance assessments came out to employers, I thought that every employer got a fund building assessment to rebuild some of the fund from depletion that was experienced during the COVID pandemic.
No, there was the influx of the $25 million from CARES Act into the UI trust fund itself. And that certainly impacts all employers across the board because of the fund balance factor that we'll talk about a little bit later. So that's a benefit to them. I don't recall the timing of that, but I believe that was before this date. So that would have impacted that, but I'm not sure what you're referring to with the fund.
Well, it seemed to me that I had a constituent call me and they were complaining about their UI assessment, which didn't surprise me. And the two things that at least in my conversation with them, that they identified as one, that they thought that generally we didn't assess if they could tie the UI claims that they experienced to COVID or to COVID, that it was not an employer assessed charge, because they were charged against the fund as a whole. I think that legislation was that way, or did that legislation not pass?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, that is the non-charging that we'll be
Okay.
talking about from the executive order. So that would have affected the employers that were closed pursuant to a public health order. So if they weren't captured within that executive order as an entity that was closed pursuant to a public health order, then they were not non-charged, double negative there, and would not have been impacted by that. However, again, the $25 million that was put into the fund would have impacted them in some manner.
So for example, if they were a restaurant and they ended up, all they could do was to carry out, and so they laid off and they laid off their wait staff, and their wait staff made unemployment claims that was chargeable against the fund, but not to them individual on their experience rating. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, if I'm understanding you correctly, if they did not close down and instead went to a takeout, then they were not captured in that non-charge order, I don't believe.
So it did affect their experience.
So it did affect their rating.
And then the other question, Mr. Chairman, was they thought that there was a fund building, that everybody's being charged, there was a fund building charge to come back up, because if I remember the numbers right, we expended 500 and some million. We got 400 and 60, anyway, we got 400 and some million from the federal government under CARES Act. And so we had about a $90 million shortfall that we actually, where our fund was actually depleted by about $90 million. Those are the numbers, if I remember our discussion from session correctly. And so, I mean, ultimately what we're getting at is how we're covering that 90, the difference between what was what we received from the federal government under the CARES Act and what was actually expended in unemployment benefits. And that's where we're headed with our discussion, I think, this morning.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, that's exactly.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next slide, please. There are 23 states that utilize CARES Act funds to replenish their UI trust funds. You can see here that New Mexico and New Hampshire at the top of the chart utilizing 50 million in CARES Act funds to replenish their trust fund. And at the bottom, you can see Georgia utilizing 995 million. Wyoming is shown as the fourth state down with the gold bar at 64 million.
So as we have this discussion, Holly, help Lloyd here to make sure that I'm tracking this right. So we're going to come in here and with 64 million, we infuse into the fund that helps the fund. But the second component of that is you have employers out there who are having all of these claims. And so just the fact that we've infused money into there doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to reduce there's another term I use, rating, moving forward, because that's going to be based on their claims. And so you could see them have a higher rate that they need to pay, even though we've infused money into that. And that's going to kind of be at the culmination of this discussion, is how do we mitigate, adversely impact them because we've been able to put money into the fund. Am I on the right trail here?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
And so for Mrs. Sessions Cooley, thank you for Holly. To follow up on the prior comment, I was surprised that the executive order was more narrowly tailored with respect to relief to employers than what the 2020 special session legislation would have authorized. So that the effect of it being that if you had half of your workforce you had to lay off, but you weren't closed, you don't get any relief at all. And so my question is, do we need legislation that doesn't just authorize the governor, the executive branch to do that, but mandates it in order to provide relief to those people?
Representative Stitt, you make a very good point, but the point that to respond to that, the language in Senate File 1002 specifically said that we were allowed to non-charge with the adoption of adequate standards and safeguards to assure the continued actuarial soundness of the fund. We took that and acted very conservatively because this is uncharted waters. We're trying to work with a fund that we've never had to do something like this with. So with the language in that, what we did was started out with putting very distinct parameters around those non-charging, the language in the non-charging for the executive order, so that we had a bright line to draw. These are individuals that would be non-charged. These are individuals that would not be non-charged. Now that's the proposal that we're talking about here today later, about going a little bit further with that and what we can do with potentially with the existing Senate File 1002.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to follow up and Representative Stitt's question, so I make sure I got it right. So last year, when we were in session, you all took our direction and applied it in a fairly conservative way. And so now the basis of this discussion today is say, should we go back and maybe open it up now with the hindsight, which is always 2020, to be able to look back at some of those folks who may have been impacted that we didn't necessarily know were going to be impacted at the time when we made that narrow distinction. That's where we're headed. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, correct. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide, please. So quickly, we're just going to look at, here are 19 states that are currently borrowing from the federal government to keep their trust funds solvent. You can see Georgia at the top, a little over 20 million, and then California at the bottom has borrowed nearly 19 billion from the federal government to continue to pay out UI benefits. Okay, next slide. When looking at the UI trust fund, drawing from the fund triggers across the board tax increases based on the statutory factors, which are meant to maintain the solvency of the UI fund. These factors are outlined in the statute and they strictly dictate how the UI tax revenues are collected. Next slide.
Oh, I'm just curious, for folks like California, they're borrowing $19 billion. What type of a borrowing rate? Is there, are they doing any special accommodations for them on this?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's a good question. There is no interest right now through September of 2021. And then we haven't heard exactly how that will work.
Like so much credit.
Well, it means that
Zero interest. So.
in the long run, that means that we're all paying for California. Okay.
Next slide, please. So let's take a look at how the tax rates are calculated. Department of Labor requires all states to establish a base rate for those UI tax rates to be in compliance. And then Wyoming has also incorporated 3 statutory factors that are designed to maintain the trust fund solvency. So we have our base rate plus those 3 statutory factors. Next slide, please.
Good.
Thank you. I don't know what ineffectively charged means.
Yes, that's coming up, Mr.
Okay.
Representative Schwartz.
Yeah, be more effective on your question.
Nice segue.
All right, so we'll quickly get there. We're going to look at we're going to look at base rates and how they're calculated for new employers and experienced employers. Next slide, please. For new employers, they have a standard base rate, which is based on the average rate assigned to all employees in that NAICS code classification. That's basically an industry classification for the previous year. Next slide, please. Experience, if an employer is considered an experienced employer, that means that they have a minimum of 3 years taxable wage history. Those employers have a base rate that is based on a UI benefits paid out ratio. So in other words, the more layoffs that happen and the more benefits that are paid out, the higher the base rate will be for that experienced rated employer. Slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to get into those 3 statutory factors. Next slide, please. So the non-charged and ineffectively charged factor is designed to replenish the UI trust fund for benefits paid out due to reasons in the statutes or if the employer is at a max non-charge experience rate. And 60% of the amounts collected from this factor in the prior year are then deposited into the UI trust fund. So as an example, if a construction company has a large amount of layoffs and is therefore at the maximum non-charge amount, non-charge experience rating, that would be an example that would fall into this. And in that example, we are hoping that short-time compensation would be a great option for those employers. And that is coming soon. Next slide, please. The employment support fund factor is based on 40% of the amount that were non-charged or ineffectively charged to employers in the prior fiscal year. And this really helps fund special programs and in particular helps to support our 20 workforce centers across the state who are really focused on reemployment right now. Next slide, please.
Good.
At the risk of being inefficient again, I still don't understand the ineffectively charged.
What's the question?
The question is, I look at this page and I mean, I did scan this. I
Yeah.
still don't get what that means, ineffectively charged.
there's a variety of reasons that could happen, Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz. And I don't know if Chris Funk is on the screen, but if we have there she is. Do you want to explain that a little bit deeper for us, Chris? Chris is our UI administrator.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Chris Funk, and I'm the Unemployment Insurance Administrator. So our tax rate statutes are very specific, and the maximum tax rate base rate that an employer can have is 8.5%. That base rate for an experience rated employer is based on a benefit ratio. So if they have a large volume of claims, it is possible that in that factor, they can go as much as like 21 or 22%, but we only charge them 8.5% by law. So that additional tax rate that we cannot collect from them then goes back into the ineffective. The purpose of charging absolutely is so that we can replenish the trust fund. When that employer maxes out at 8.5%, then we don't have that ability to assess that to them personally. So those additional taxes that we lose based on that difference between the 8.5% and what their actual benefit ratio is goes into that ineffective charge.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So why we've got your lifeline on the line. It's always nice to phone a friend. So I have a quick question for you. Do we have employers? I will call it gaming the system. We have employers that take advantage of this, that with this max rate, and so ultimately with their employment practices, this seems to be where they exceed the maximum non-charge experience rate on a regular basis. And so ultimately a significant portion of their unemployment benefits are then deferred and paid for by all Wyoming state employers through the fund. Do we know that?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. I don't know that they purposely do it, but we do see it often, and it's mostly in the construction industry because their work is so seasonal. And so they're the type of industry most likely that they'll work everyone, and then they'll have a period where they have no one working. I would guess that a good share of the time, I don't know the statistics, but they also lay them off job attached, which means they don't have to look for a job during that time period. So they're probably more prone to continue to stay on unemployment, and the way the law works, they're allowed to. So construction is absolutely, I mean, I've seen as much as 30% because they lay everyone off. Holly Simone had mentioned that we're really hoping the STC will help with this. What we really want to do is target those types of industries that tend to run higher than the 8.5% and encourage them to use something like STC. You know, if you can just reduce hours instead of laying everyone off, that will help, because then the benefit charges that are paid out are actually charged back to them instead of into this ineffective factor that goes to everyone. So we're really hoping that can be a tool to help us with that too, because you're exactly right. I don't know that they purposely do it, but I think they know that once they get to that 8.5%, it's not going to cost them anymore. So they maybe don't manage things as well as they could.
Well, when you say the STC, what would they do to manage that? Or are there things that we can do legislatively to address it? Because, I mean, it is a cost benefit to them to have other people pay their unemployment costs. And they'll continue to do it as long as they can do it, because that's how they make more money.
Mr. Chairman, so short-time compensation, STC that we've been calling it, I'm sure most of you know. So what we're hoping is that we can encourage them to at least allow the employees to continue to work so many hours, even a portion of the staff, instead of just laying everyone off. Of course, we haven't done it yet because it's not in place, but we're hoping that we can target that. The only other thing would be is to, you know, approach seasonality, which we've talked about is very, very difficult as well. Or restructure, because when you get into an experience rate, there's nothing about specific industry. So, I mean, it is a possibility that we could put something in, you know, as an exception to how the experience rate works. You could raise it above the 8.5%. Most employers don't even go close to the 8.5%. And it's like most of them are until COVID, a lot of them were at the minimum and 0 experience rate. And so, I mean, you could raise that 8.5%. And if you did, then that would not go into the ineffective charge then.
So how often do you, as an agency, review this type of an issue and then make proposed rule changes to accommodate?
Mr. Chairman, until COVID hit, I would suspect we didn't look at it that often because it hasn't been an issue of this magnitude. Certainly, it'll be something we'll be looking at moving forward, especially as Chris Funk indicated, when we've got STC stood up, and the benefit that it will be to employers if they're willing to take advantage of it, and looking at whether there's going to be abuses.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Next slide, please. Oh, that's the right one. Thank you. The fund balance factor keeps the UI trust fund at a solvent level that is sufficient to pay benefits to claimants, but which is also not more than is needed. Wyoming is one of the few states that has an automatic fund balance factor. So if numerous benefits are paid out, the fund balance factor number will likely be a positive number in that calculation. If minimal benefits are paid out, then that number will likely be a negative number. And that negative number helps offset the other 2 factors for long-term employers and provides a lower tax rate. Historically speaking, Wyoming experienced a time in the 1980s when the trust fund was not solvent. And so the current formula was developed to maintain fund solvency for future years. And I believe Senator Scott helped develop this. Next slide, please.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So on the employment support fund factor and the fund balance factor, are those spread, are those applicable to just individual employers, or are they system or industry-wide assessments, or is there, how specific are those other assessments, the employment support fund factor and the fund balance factor?
So, Mr. Chairman, Senator Perkins, those fund factors are based on the amount of non-charged and effectively charged, and then put in from the prior fiscal year. So that's spread across that formula.
So, Mr. Chairman, but so we're talking, so we go back here, we'll just use the example we had just a minute ago. We have a construction company that for COVID or for seasonal reasons has laid off significant people. There's ineffectively charged rates that come back. So that means that's going to pull into effect. Now that brings into effect both the employment support fund factor, correct?
Correct.
And it also will affect the fund balance factor if there's a significant drain on the fund itself. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Perkins, that is.
And so do those factors, do they come back, and those factors all go into what the unemployment tax rate is for individual employers, correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Perkins, it goes into that formula, yes.
And so does that, so going back to the employment support fund factor, does that hit just the employer whose effective rate, who was charged in effect, or who had employment claims in excess of their effective rate? Is it just charged to that employer, or is it charged to all employers across the state, or is it more focused charge than that?
I believe that is spread across all employers.
Okay. And so what about the fund balance factors? That spread across all employers in the same manner?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Perkins, yes.
Okay. Okay. So when I had that constituent call me and he said that there was an assessment, it was most likely did we put into effect in this last go round a fund balance factor? Was that assessed in the most recent assessments to employers?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Perkins and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that is always the calculation. Those factors are utilized when assessing the UI tax rate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, now I want to talk to you about unemployment tax rates in the pandemic and what the governor and this legislature has done to provide assistance to employers around the state. And I didn't practice this with looking at this, and this is a little tiny, so I'm going to look at the big screen if I can. Two things were done. There have been an influx of funds into the UI trust fund. 64,000 approximately funding has gone into there with the initial 25 million, and then the second 39 million tranche. As Ms. McCamey Simone indicated, that's really the impact there has been to that fund balance factor. Anytime you're going to put money into there, that fund balance factor is going to be adjusted, and it's going to be a benefit across the board to employers across the state. Then per Senate File 1002, we also were allowed to non-charge employers, and we chose to do that pursuant to public health orders. Both actions worked collectively to keep rates low through 2024. But I'd like to talk about each one of those more specifically. So next slide, please. Again, I wanted to speak to you specifically about the language that's in Senate File 1002. We took our charge from the legislature very seriously to keep that fund a solvent fund. And so we looked at this very conservatively, and that's how we built the parameters around that as they related to the public health orders. Next slide. So what we did in that executive order is we built parameters around the non-charging to only relate to individuals who were to non-charge individuals that were closed pursuant to public health orders. That was the only way we could think of at the time that we could really draw these bright line rules so that we wouldn't have a lot of appeals. We wouldn't have people questioning whether or not they fit within that. And the non-charging, I would point out, when you non-charge like that, that's going to benefit employers through 2024. Next slide.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So this last slide that says executive order, is that referring to the existing executive order, or is this a proposed executive order?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stiff, that's correct. The existing executive order.
Okay, so when the slide says COVID-related layoffs, that description is actually broader than what actually happened.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
So then, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, what we heard from the legislature as well as individually from employers was it didn't impact them. It wasn't enough. They were concerned that there were a number of employers, of course, out there that were impacted by COVID, but weren't captured within those public health orders. So what we did was we looked back at that Senate file language, and I want to pull that language out if I may. There was a particular portion in that language that caused me some concern. So we pulled that out and looked at that, and the last sentence of that, the last part of that sentence indicated that the charges should not be charged due to circumstances related to the unique coronavirus COVID-19. So what we did was look back at that language, back at how these statutory factors all interrelate to each other, recognizing that we could capture all employers in this language here, because across the board, you saw how the interdependence of those statutory factors did cause an impact to all employers in the state. So working with our Attorney General's office, we recognize that this language does allow us to go back and non-charge all employers in the state for a period of time from March to December 31. So with an amended executive order, that's actually what we're proposing, what we've proposed to the governor to do, and that will assist all employers in the state. And we do not need any legislative change other than the language you've got in the Senate file right now. What we would like to do as well with that, we figured out, and I will be honest with you, when we talked about the initial tranches of money that were put into the fund, we knew that those monies would help because of that fund balance factor, but we weren't drawing a correlation between non-charging and what that would cost the fund and the amount of money coming into the fund. We weren't looking at that correlation. So what we've done with this most recent proposal is Chris and her team did an excellent job and did the calculation to determine what is the amount of money we would need to then backfill into the fund in order to maintain that fund balance. So again, so we don't want to have them just have an immediate relief, but then in 2022, their rates just go up again because that fund balance is lower. So with 58 million proposed to put back into the fund, we think we can balance out that additional non-charging in the proposed amended executive order.
And Robin, is that over and above the 64 million that's already been put in there?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. What I'd like to do is really show you a real life next slide, please. What we'd like to do is show you an actual example of what we are projecting, what's happened to an employer, and what we project an additional non-charge and additional funds into the account could benefit that employer. So I want to take you to the far right column there. This is a small dental office. We figured that this dental office has maybe 3-4 employees in it. Taxable wages across the board with our calculations are at $314,000. Looking at their 2028 rate, this is before COVID hit. We've got a 0.09% rate with $314,000 taxable wages. Their total UI tax is $282.60. Pretty low. And again, if we didn't mention it before, please remember that going into the pandemic, we were at historically low unemployment tax rates, historically. So we went from this, it's the perfect storm, we went from this historical low to potential historical high. So that's what we started out with. Then I'd like to go to the other side of the chart here. This is the projection of this dental office's rate without any influx of funds into the UI trust fund. Their tax rate would go up to 2.55%, again, taxable wages at $314,000. Their total UI tax could have been over $8,000. That's not recognizing the influx of money into the UI trust fund. So the next column here, we're talking about what did that influx of, those initial influxes of fund into the account, how did they benefit that employer? That employer's rate went down somewhat to 2.42%, and their UI tax rate went down again a little bit more to $7,500. So what we want to do then is take a look at if we non-charge them, and we also added the $58 million into the UI trust fund, what would that look like for this employer? And remember, dental offices were not captured in the public health fund because they weren't closed pursuant to a public health fund, but most, if not all of them, closed based on the American Dental Association and CDC recommendations that they did close. So they did the right thing and closed down, but unfortunately they weren't captured in that. So what would happen to their rates if we did non-charge and add that money? Their rate goes down all the way to 0.48%, again, same taxable wage, and their total UI tax then is $1,500. Saving them over $6,000. That's pretty significant. And that really kind of brings home what it looks like for an average employer in Wyoming, I think, with this proposed new amended executive order.
So Robin, seems to me it might be realistic to take in consideration what PPP dollars they got, because typically an office of that size would probably receive anywhere between $150,000 and $200,000 in PPP dollars.
Mr. Chairman, that's a good point. We have not looked at it from that standpoint, solely from our calculations, but that's a good point. Yes.
What they laid off, they would. For PPP, you got less.
We're arguing.
Go ahead.
No, Mr. Chairman, I was just trying to hear what was being argued.
Mr. Chairman, the lesson there would be for everybody to get closer to their mics.
No, they love it. Make sure you get mics off if you don't want to.
All right, go ahead, Rob.
Thank you. Next slide. This has been a continuing question that we hear from individuals. So we did want to give you some numbers here. How long?
Mr. Chairman, before we, going back to your last, going back one page. Second, the third column on the right, that includes the 25.
Mr. Chairman, that third column includes the 25 million plus the 39 million and a potential influx, a proposed influx of 58 million in.
Right. But if we go one third column to the left. Say, use the 25 million. That was 25 million. First.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, that's correct.
Thank you.
Senator Drew?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The co-chair brought up a interesting point about PPP dollars and how that worked. I won't argue with that. I think they were carrying on that argument just fine. My question on the second, it's where we are right now, 25 million and 39 million, that second page, where that dentist office paying $7,598.80. Based on their experience rating as of now, how long, if that same dentist office now had no more layoffs, there were no more global pandemics and things went back to normal or whatever that is now, new normal, how long does that rate stay that way? How does, if he has is the experience rating in his or her office stays the same, eventually that will lower a bit, won't it, over time? And what is the time factor?
Mr. Chairman.
So 3 years. So they're going to pay 75, 98, 80, 3 years. So it would maybe start to come down a little bit.
Well, it won't be a little bit. It could go back down to 0.09. Is that right?
Well, the way the statutory factor, Mr. Chairman, the way the statutory factors are calculated and the experience rating is calculated, it will be that rate for up to 3 years.
Yeah, but after 3 years,
After
they
3
could,
years,
they could
yes,
go down to
correct.
0.09.
Right.
Correct.
But during that, Mr. Chairman, during that 3 year period, it would stay pretty close to that. It might go down a little bit, but it would stay pretty close to that.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Drew, that's my.
Thank you.
And just to follow up, if I didn't say this before, with the proposed amended executive order and the additional funding, that will last or potentially benefit employers well into 2024.
So what we don't have here is where we are at with the additional tranche of 39 million. So it'd be a column in between those two, right?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct, because those tax rates have not been calculated.
Do we know, is that going to take it down roughly to like 1.5% or?
Mr. Chairman, we could figure that, but I will tell you that the column with 58 million and the non-charge is calculated with that 58 million and the 39.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Correct. As you can see, members of the committee, it's significant with the ability to non-charge and then raise those funds up because of the way those statutory factors are calculated. And I I just want to add to Department of Labor, federal law requires that we have that base rate in there. It doesn't require these statutory factors. That's really something unique to Wyoming. We believe in our historical research has indicated in the 80s, the trust fund was not solvent. And this legislature came in and developed these statutory factors. And the purpose of those factors is to ensure the solvency of that fund. And don't forget, we've got the UI trust fund, but we've also got a backup state trust fund that generally maintains about a little bit over $50 million in it too. So if we were to run out of the federal UI fund, we've got that to rely on for a short period.
So my question would be, using this scenario, do you have ways to calculate what the overall benefit would be to all employers? If we kicked in the 58 million, how much money would they save in reduced benefits? I mean, is there any how do we quantify it?
Mr. Chairman, we can work on that. That's a difficult question. That's why we wanted to give you maybe a snapshot of one business. Going across industries, every business is going to be different because they're going to have different benefit charges against them. So every one of them is going to be different. We could potentially work on an average for you, an average in a couple of different industries, if that would be helpful.
It just seems to me it would be useful if we could say by spending $58 million of ARPA dollars or CARES Act dollars, we are saving the employers of the state the equivalent. That basically that's money that would otherwise come out of their pocket.
And Mr. Chairman, that's correct because of that the way that it's built to replenish those funds.
Director Cooley, it's the answer to that's 58 million. We know what the shortfall is, and so either that's going to be made up by those non-charged employers, and to get that back, or we infuse that. And so am I reading that wrong? So if we're really wanting to impact the employers, this will save the employers as a whole, not by category, but the employers of the state of Wyoming, $58 million.
Well, in reality, it's 122 million.
Yeah, true, fair enough.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I think that's accurate. Yes.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. He's quicker than I am.
Before you leave that. So if, and I was just trying to remember for employers that had no employee benefits. So there were no employee claims related to COVID or otherwise. They had no employee claims during that period. They were able to maintain full employment. How much did their taxes go up? So then they're just hit with the balance fund factor and the other one for ineffective charge rates.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, I don't know how much they went up, but you can bet they did go up. I can't quantify that with a percentage. I just don't know again because industries are going to be different. But
I'll look at mine when I get back to the office and I'll have that answer because I know mine went up substantially. We didn't have any claims, so.
Across the board,
yeah,
tax rates went up.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, trust fund balance. Where do we sit? How do we look? Ms. McCamey Simone indicated we look solvent based on DOL and some of their metrics. But what are our numbers? December 31 of 2020, trust fund balance of about $284 million. And again, that mentions the state trust fund balance. Again, that's something unique to Wyoming with having a backup state fund balance like that. What we estimate from that is these will cover about 1.8 years of benefit payments based on the 2020 benefits payment paid out. But that doesn't take into consideration any tax revenue collection. So if you look at that revenue collection based on some average collections, 2020, we're looking at about a little bit over 4 years of benefit payments that we could pay out if we've got a steady collection coming in and the number of employers in the state of Wyoming stayed pretty stable. So we're a solvent fund. All right, I also understood, next slide, please. I also understood you had a few questions about workers' compensation.
Let's, why don't we take a 10-minute break? 10:40.
Good.
Are back. Robin, please proceed with the workers' comp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I leave the UI, the work UI information, I do want to indicate that the governor is very much in favor of the amended executive order. It's in the works and we're discussing it more, but I did want to make that point as well.
For the 58 million.
That's correct.
And that's, Kevin, going to be the additional CARES Act dollars that we recapture?
Mr. Chairman, I do believe that the FEMA will be a big player in that.
Okay.
Okay, so we wanted to also just briefly talk to you a little bit about workers' compensation and some of the COVID benefit relief packages that the legislature and the governor have worked on, again, for businesses across the state. As you'll recall, in the special session, Senate File 1002, and I'm sorry, next slide. Senate File 1002 did provide a premium credit. And as you'll recall, the session before that, there was a premium credit provided during that time as well for a month's credit. This Senate File 1002 added an additional premium credit for employers that assisted them during that time frame. There was also a COVID presumption that was provided in Senate File 102 for individuals that were at work. Let me read that language. If you're at work, was added to the definition of injury for the period between January 1, 2020 through December 30, 2020. If the employee in an employment sector for which coverage is provided is infected with COVID-19 coronavirus, it shall be presumed that the risk of contracting the illness or disease was increased by the nature of employment. We call that the COVID presumption. So that COVID presumption then was extended in this last legislative session again as well. Next slide. So we just wanted to break down for you the dollars that Workforce Services has received in order to, again, help the work comp fund recoup some of those monies paid out. For the premium credit, DWS did receive a little bit over $14 million in CARES Act funds. Those costs are broken down there a little bit for the premium credit, as well as some administrative funds. We also wanted to point out that we've also received a number of medical COVID claims related to that presumption that was provided in legislation. Here's the amount of funds that have been replenished for those medical claims and the amount not replenished for those claims. And I want to let you know those claims are ongoing. We do have some long hauler symptoms. We're keeping our eye on that and monitoring it, but it is it's somewhat of a concern of ours that we'll be paying some of those presumptive COVID claims for a number of years. But I want to make sure that was out there. And I think unless there are questions, that's really all I had related to workers' comp
So
updates.
I'm curious. You had what you are calling workers' comp medical COVID directly claims of 549,000. So those are people who contracted COVID and they contracted it at work or presumed at work.
Correct.
What we don't see is what your total premiums received were, and if you're still paying out more than you are receiving overall. In other words, is there a general loss in the overall fund, or what's the stability of the fund?
Mr. Chairman, for the COVID-related claims, yes, there's a continued payout from the funds for a loss to the fund that has not been replenished.
I just don't understand how you're doing your calculations, though, because you're going to have a bunch of claims no matter what. And the question is, based upon all contributions for all employers, what's your payout versus your retention of funds on the overall balance of the fund? Because I don't see those numbers here. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I'm following you. No, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Director Cooley, or Jason, whoever that is, so when we passed that legislation saying that COVID could be a worker's claim, we also made it where it wasn't attributable back to the employer's experience rating, correct?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, we did in the initial legislation, Senate File 1002, when that was carried forward this past legislative session, that was an omission from that legislation. So we were looking at that, working with our Attorney General's office to determine if we have existing authority in our discretionary rules to be able to ensure that those do not work against their experience rating.
But if they're, Mr. Chairman, but if they're not attributed to the experience rating, that would account for that deficiency in the fund as it relates to COVID payout. So we're paying out, and the increase of that, we're probably not going to see that reflected if it's not impacting, if we're not going to impact the employers. Is that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's correct. Jason, would you have anything to add to that?
There we go. Mr. Chairman, no, Director Cooley, I wouldn't have anything, I don't think, to add.
So what's the balance of the fund now?
Mr. Chairman, as of, I got it right here, just 1 second. So, Mr. Chairman, as of June 30, 2020, the total balance of the fund just 1 second here. It's about 2.3 billion. I believe today, as of March, I think when we offloaded some data to the actuary, it was about 2.43 billion.
So, and that's kind of what I was trying to get at. If the fund has gone up $100,000. Well, yeah. Then it's actually more actuarially sound now than it was a year ago.
Yeah.
And so if you talk about leaving a $3.9 million non-replenishment, in the big picture, that's really a drop in the bucket to the total fund. I mean, it's, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. I mean, that would fall into what we call the provision for adverse deviation, or the PFAD. We have a certain amount of money on hand to cover things like that, where we run into a shortfall that wouldn't then affect the employer's experience.
On your COVID medical claims, did you end up, well, my first question is, did any folks who contracted COVID at work and it's covered under workers' comp pass away? Do you have any death loss?
Mr. Chairman, unfortunately, yes, we have had 5 fatalities filed with the division.
And the of that 549,000, were any of those on respirators or?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know about respirators. I can tell you that we've had a fair amount of people that have contracted the virus that have, been life flighted to Denver for further critical care. But I don't know that we have anybody in the hospital now on a respirator or vent.
So out of those claims, that could be one claim right there. It's not that much. If you're in a hospital for 17 weeks or 7 weeks, and you're on an ECMO machine and a ventilator.
Mr. Chairman, yes. And I would say kind of to those funds that we're talking about, I mean, of those 5 fatalities, I think 4 of them have paid out at this point, and those vary in range. I mean, depending on the, surviving children or surviving spouse, as you know, but a couple of those, 2 of those were around the $800,000 range. So, I mean, 2 claims almost, $2 million. So a fair chunk of those gets when we get into that fatality and people who may have permanent type of disability from it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Will you stand for any more questions? But that was.
Any more questions for Robin? Okay, thanks. Appreciate it. Let me just ask that, the last question that wasn't answered. There's no, I take it that there's no indication or need at this point to add further dollars into the fund based upon COVID claims, because it's actually fairly solvent. Is that fair?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I mean, it is solvent. I would really probably need to confer with the actuary as to what, not replenishing the X million of dollars for COVID related expenses, how that might affect the fund, or how it would affect employers' rates, base rates going forward. But
So you haven't done that analysis yet?
Mr. Chairman, we have not done a formal analysis, but I think based on some of the historical knowledge of the fund, I would say it wouldn't have a great effect, just because, like you said, I mean, the amount of money is kind of a drop in the bucket, so.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next, we're going to qualifying characteristics of drinking water. Is that right, Don? Jennifer, where are you? There you are. So before you, is there any public comment on any further discussions that we had regarding unemployment insurance and workers' comp? Any public comment? All right, seeing none, we'll close public comment. And off we go.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Jennifer Scoggin, the Director of the Office of State Lands and Investments. And from my shop today, we have Beth Blackwell, our Grants and Loans Manager, and we have Amanda Sewell. She's our Assistant Director for our Financial Services Division. We also have today our sister agencies, DEQ and Director Parfit. I believe that Director Gebhardt, he may be on Zoom. I'm not quite sure, but Director Parfit, perhaps you'd like to introduce who you have with you here today too.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. With me is the interim or acting water quality administrator for the DEQ, and also Bill Tillman, who is the manager, currently acting manager for the water and wastewater program and implementation of the SRF. So we're here to provide whatever additional information you might request going forward.
Okay.
And it looks like Director Gebhardt is here with Zoom. Director Gebhardt, perhaps you want to introduce the folks that are in the room here for water development.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brandon Gebhardt, I'm the Director of Water Development. And in the room is Deputy Director Barry Lawrence and Wade Verplanke, who runs our portion of the SRF program.
Welcome, everybody.
Mr. Chairman, we thought it might be helpful for the committee to kind of do a clean water SRF and drinking water SRF kind of 101 program or 101 presentation so that everybody.
100.1.
So that everyone can understand the program that we have currently. I understand with the ARPA funding, there have been some states that wanted to pour money into existing systems or into existing programs. And so if in fact that was a consideration for this committee, we wanted you to understand what's there. And so we'll do sort of our primer on the SRF programs, and then we'll just have a couple of comments at the end on ARPA. So with that, I do have a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, next slide, please. So the Wyoming Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, these provide assistance to Wyoming residents through local government entities. It provides loans at below or right at market interest rates for design and construction of water and sewer projects. Next slide. The programs are 80% funded through annual capitalization grants These are awarded through EPA. The state is required to provide a 20% funding match for each of the programs. In the Clean Water Program, the funding match is appropriated from the Corrective Action Account, which is managed by DEQ. The Drinking Water Match is funded 10% through Water Development's account 1 or 2, and the other 10% comes from the MRG through OSLI. Next slide. So this is a very busy slide, and I know you can't get much out of it, but there has been some confusion with respect to how the program is administered. And essentially, the three agencies work together, OSLI, DEQ, and Water Development. But the State Loan and Investment Board is the recipient of the capitalization grants from EPA. And so therefore OSLI actually administers the program. And on this busy slide, it gives you some of the duties that we perform. And I'll just give you some highlights. We actually apply for the capitalization grants. We do the annual reporting. We do the written annual reports to EPA. We track funds. We vet and underwrite the submitted applications, working with DEQ and Water Development, depending upon the program. We prepare the board matters with funding recommendations to the SLIB, and we present those. If the SLIB approves the funding for the project, then we track all of the loan documents on the other end. So next slide, please. Whoops, go back. There we go. So this gives you an idea of some of the Water Development Office program responsibilities. Water Development provides technical assistance for the drinking water program only. They complete technical reviews for the applications. They review and approve the bid documents. They complete a technical review for pay requests, review change orders, perform project inspections, and assist with preparation of the annual intended use plan for the drinking water program. And I'll talk about the IUP here in a little bit. Next slide, please. And this slide gives you an idea of some of the responsibilities for the Department of Environmental Quality. They provide technical assistance for the Clean Water SRF program only, but is also tasked with some duties related to both programs. They complete technical reviews of the submitted applications. They review and approve bid documents for clean water projects. They do technical review for clean water pay requests. They perform inspections related to clean water. They also review and approve the required environmental assessments, capacity development for drinking water, and they prepare the annual clean water and drinking water intended use plans with assistance from OSLI and Water Development. Next slide, please. So again, you're not going to get much out of this. This is a very detailed flow chart, but suffice it to say, as I mentioned, that OSLI receives the applications. We then consult with Water Development, with DEQ, as well as EPA to make sure that projects are in fact eligible for funding. We also look at, depending on the program, the ability of the applicant to repay the loans. We then present the projects to SLIB for approval, and then we manage and administer the loans and the paperwork on the back end, and then we have to comply with all of the audits and program sort of tracking that goes along with the federal requirements. Next slide, please. So let's get into some specific details about the SRF programs. Let's start with clean water. The Clean Water SRF was created by the 1987 amendments to the Clean Water Act as a financial assistance program for a wide range of infrastructure projects. It was amended in 2014 by the Water Resources Reform and Development Act, which provided the Clean Water Program with the authority to utilize a portion of the capitalization grant as subsidization in the form of principal forgiveness. And the allowable portion ranges from 0% to 30%, depending upon the degree in which the annual appropriation exceeds $1 billion. Next slide, please. So the eligible applicants for the clean water loans and principal forgiveness are municipalities, counties, special districts, joint powers board, and state agencies. With respect to the special districts and joint powers boards, they must be formed and approved before the application is presented to the SLIB. With respect to state agencies, DEQ utilizes funds for their corrective action at their leaking underground storage tank sites. Entities that apply for these funds must comply with Department of Audit and Department of Revenue reporting requirements and demonstrate that prior to their applications being considered by the SLIB as well. Next slide, please. So we understand the committee's interest in the Clean Water SRF and the Drinking Water SRF with respect to eligibility for those programs as the ARPA program has indicated that those projects that are eligible for clean water or drinking water would be the types of water and sewer infrastructure projects that could be eligible for ARPA funds. And so that's one of the reasons why we supplied each of you with copies of EPA's handbooks for clean water and drinking water. Nevertheless, we're going to go through high level the project categories, but to the extent you want to drill down into some more of the detail, I think those handbooks are pretty helpful in helping flesh out the situations they're talking about. So for clean water, there are 11 eligible project categories. The first is construction of publicly owned treatment works. The next is implementation of a state non-point source pollution management program. Then we have national estuary program projects, which deal with development and implementation of a conservation and management plan. We have decentralized wastewater treatment systems, which are construction, repair, or replacement of decentralized wastewater treatment systems that treat municipal wastewater or domestic sewage. Then there's the stormwater category, which is to manage, reduce, treat, and recapture stormwater or subsurface drainage water. Then there's the water conservation, efficiency, and reuse. And it's measures to reduce the demand for publicly owned treatment works capacity through water conservation, efficiency, or reuse. Next slide, please. We'll continue. There are watershed pilot projects, which are assistance for the development and implementation of watershed projects meeting certain criteria under the Clean Water Act. Energy efficiency, which are measures to reduce the energy consumption needs for publicly owned treatment works. Water reuse, which is reusing or recycling wastewater, stormwater, or subsurface drainage water. Then there are funds for measures to increase the security of publicly owned treatment works. And then there's technical assistance to owners and operators of small and medium-sized publicly owned treatment works to plan, develop, and obtain financing for eligible projects and to assist each treatment works in achieving compliance with the Clean Water Act. Next slide, please. So you'll notice that these are some eligible project types. This is not an exclusive list. These are listed, I believe, in the handbook that we provided you. And it goes everything from energy conservation, stormwater, resource extraction. Interestingly, landfills, I believe what the handbook talks about there is closure and leachate collection and treatment processes. Silviculture, forestry activities like removal of streamside vegetation, roadside construction and use, timber thinning, harvesting, site preparation for tree planting. So there are quite a number of topics. It's one of those things where, you know, come to us with your project and we'll look and see if there's a way that it's eligible or qualifies. A lot of these things are fact specific based on the type of project that's presented. There may be aspects of a project that qualify. And so we certainly want to work, the three sister agencies want to work with everybody to determine eligibility. Next slide, please. So these are typically the funded projects that we see here in Wyoming. Installation or upgrade of wastewater treatment facilities, sewer line replacements and extensions, wastewater collection systems, stormwater facilities, and other non-point source pollution control activities. Next slide. Okay, briefly, we'll get into the drinking water SRF program. It was created as part of the 1996 amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act. The principal objective of drinking water SRF is to facilitate compliance with the national primary drinking water regulations or otherwise significantly advance the public health protection objectives of the Act. Eligible applicants, I think that's the next slide, please, are publicly owned water systems in Wyoming. They can be community or non-community water systems. Again, if they're a special district or a joint powers board, they must be legally formed and approved prior to submission of the application. And again, they must be in compliance with Department of Audit, Department of Revenue reporting requirements prior to consideration by the board. Next slide, please. Ineligible water systems under the drinking water SRF loan funds are federally owned public water systems, for-profit non-community water systems, systems that lack the technical, managerial, and financial capability to ensure compliance with the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act, unless the assistance is going to ensure compliance and the operator agrees to undertake feasible and appropriate changes in operation to ensure compliance over the long term, and systems that have enforcement priority with any national primary drinking water regulation or variance, unless the purpose of the assistance is to address the cause of significant non-compliance. The assistance will ensure that the system returns to compliance, and the purpose of the assistance is unrelated to the cause of the significant non-compliance. Next slide, please. So here are the 6 eligible drinking water SRF project categories. There is funding for treatment, which would mean projects that in which we install or upgrade facilities to improve drinking water quality to comply with safe drinking water regulations. Transmission and distribution, which includes rehabilitation, replacement, or installation of pipes to improve water pressure to safe levels or prevent contamination caused by leaky or broken pipes. There's source funding for rehabilitation of wells or development of eligible sources to replace contaminated sources. There's storage, which deals with installation or upgrading finished water storage tanks to prevent microbiological contamination from entering the system. There's consolidation when you're interconnecting 2 or more water systems, or there's creation of new systems in which you construct a new system to serve homes with a contaminated individual well, or you consolidate existing systems into a new regional water system. Next slide, please. There are ineligible projects for drinking water assistance, and the first one deals with rehabilitation of dams. And I'll jump down to the third one, which talks about rehabilitation of reservoirs. And the reason why I'm focusing on those is that on July 14th, EPA actually issued a memorandum approving a class exception from regulatory prohibitions on the use of drinking water SRF for rehabilitation of dams and reservoirs. But in order to qualify, the primary purpose of the dam or reservoir must be for drinking water supply and must be owned by the public water system. And so examples of, I think, the funding would be for spillway reconstruction or repair, dam resurfacing or repair, replacement of drainage systems, or sedimentation dredging. The exception is not, however, to support population growth. The idea is to provide safe drinking water supply and improve public health protections for drinking water systems existing populations. So there is a new sort of exception there. The other ineligible projects are purchase of water rights in certain circumstances, projects that are primarily for fire protection or primarily serve future growth population, or they have received assistance in the case of Indian tribes and from the Alaska Native villages. Next slide, please. So typically funded drinking water projects that we look at are installation and upgrade of water treatment facilities, water line replacements or extensions, installing new or upgraded water meters, and new water wells. Next slide, please. Okay, now that we've looked at the eligibility, the SLIB SRF programs also require that a project be listed on an intended use plan. And that's, the states have flexibility to tailor their ranking process, but essentially entities come and say, hey, we've got a project, and then OSLI, DEQ, and Water Development kind of look at what the projects are, they rank them, and these are on the list. And every January, they sort of update the list for new projects. Then for some reason, there's a requirement that SLIB must approve the drinking water IUP but the clean water IUP is actually informational to the SLIB. So I don't know why that is. But the clean water IUP places the highest priority on the water quality needs, whereas the drinking water IUP has projects that address the most serious risks to human health, are necessary to ensure compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act, and assist the systems in need, most in need according to state affordability criteria. Next slide, please. So projects that utilize SRF funds, since they're primarily federal funds, must comply with certain criteria. And this is not an exhaustive list of what those are, but you kind of get the idea. It's essentially NEPA, Davis-Bacon. The projects must incorporate American iron and steel, and on down the list. And so even if there's like ARPA funds would be used for match funding, or if they're poured into the SRF program, the projects would still have to comply with all these. Per federal regulation, if there's even 1 cent of federal funding utilized in the project, then they must meet these requirements, even if it's a phased project. Next slide, please. So additional subsidies that are part of the Clean Water SRF and Drinking Water SRF programs, we have Principal Forgiveness and Green Project Reserve. Next slide, please. So in 2009, Principal Forgiveness was introduced to the programs, and both programs are able to take advantage of that. There is, however, in the Clean Water program, an affordability criteria, which is utilized to award the Principal Forgiveness, and it's essentially a point system. And they looked at population trends, income data, and unemployment data. They come up with a point system to see sort of the range of principal forgiveness that you can qualify for with your project. Next slide, please. With our drinking water program, we've developed a disadvantaged communities program, which essentially does the same thing. It looks at this same sort of affordability criteria, population trend, income data, and unemployment data to determine the points or the band for the amount of principal forgiveness that the project will qualify for. Next slide, please. Green Project Reserve Loan. The types of green projects eligible for a subsidy include water efficiency improvements, energy efficiency improvements, green infrastructure, and environmentally innovative activities. And the idea is that if there's a green element to the project, it can receive an interest rate of 0% for that element. So as you might imagine, some projects may be 100% green, while others may just have portions of the project that are eligible for that 0% interest. Next slide, please. And these are some of the sort of green projects that have been funded, not necessarily by us, but by us, okay. So you'll see solar panels at a sewage treatment works plant to promote energy efficiency, irrigation, reuse of irrigation water is water conservation, wind turbines at a sewage treatment works plant. Down on the drinking water side, we've got new water meters where none previously existed, variable frequency drives on water well pumps, wind turbines to power pumps at wells, hydropower projects. So you get the idea. Those are considered to be green projects. So next slide. With our current SRF program, we have loans. The Clean Water SRF loans are generally for up to 30 years, depending on the useful life of the project. Drinking water is up to 20 years, depending on the useful life of the project. However, if you qualify as a disadvantaged community, you're eligible to receive a loan term of 30 years. The standard interest rate is 2.5% with an origination fee of 0.5%. Next slide, please. In 2021, in order to, for a variety of reasons, we decided to tweak our SRF programs a little bit. We've had difficulty getting money out the door. As you might imagine, applicants don't want loans, they want grants. And so they would rather go to MRG and some of the other loan programs to get grants to fund projects that likely could be funded under these programs. Due to our small population in the state, Also, with respect to drinking water, many people are on individual wells instead of, some of the larger, even medium-sized municipal systems. So it impacts our ability to get projects in and get funds out the door. So we thought, what could we do to make our program more competitive with other loan programs, to make it more desirable when principal forgiveness is not available, because principal forgiveness, there's only so much per capitalization grant. And once we run out of that, it's not available anymore. And also to make the program more attractive to the state's larger communities who, with the point system, don't really qualify for principal forgiveness. So we decided to take on a tiered interest rate. So next slide, please. So when principal forgiveness is not available, instead of being able to take advantage of the principal forgiveness, we thought a lower interest rate loan might be palatable. So if on that point system that we talked about, you were eligible for 75% principal forgiveness, we now offer a 0.75% interest rate. So you can see on down the line there, those tiered interest rates. And then for those larger communities that generally don't qualify for principal forgiveness, they could receive an interest rate of 1.75%. Next slide, please. The other thing we did in 2021, again, to try to generate interest in the program, is to do a large loan incentive interest rates, trying to encourage people to take out loans for larger amounts of money. And so you'll see in the clean water large loan categories, for instance, a band of 7.5 million up to 10 million, we are offering a 1.5% interest rate. The drinking water for projects between 5 million up to 7.5 million, we are offering a 1.5% interest rate. Next slide, please. So the program status as of June 30th, our current available balance in the clean water program is 118 million. There is no principal forgiveness available. The total number of loans we've made are 133 loans totaling over $405 million. The number of loans we currently have dispersing are 29 loans totaling more than $174 million. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is the drinking water program status. Current amount available is 129 million. Available principal forgiveness is 0. The number of loans made, we've made 234 loans totaling 314 million. And then the number of loans currently dispersing, 26 totaling over $151 million. Or excuse me, 51 million. Next slide, please. Okay, now just some general comments about ARPA and how does all this sort of eligibility translate into ARPA funds? And so ARPA has stated that those funds are for water and sewer sort of development projects. There are still a lot of unanswered questions that we have. There's not a whole lot in the way of guidance other than if they qualify for funding under the drinking water SRF or the clean water SRF, they likely qualify for ARPA funds. And as you are aware, the language in the ARPA final interim rule provides a wide latitude to identify investments in water and sewer infrastructure and a lot of flexibility to the states to prioritize that infrastructure based on needs. Next slide, please. We have reviewed that final interim rule and just sort of categorized the Treasury, what the Treasury guidance says concerning potentially eligible projects. And as you might imagine, it lines up almost perfectly with all the clean water and drinking water eligibility requirements that we just talked about. So you can see those there. Next slide. This is just a continuation of some of the things that they've discussed in the rule. Notably, the interim final rule also encourages green infrastructure to improve resilience for the impacts of climate change. Some of the examples they've used are increased instances of stormwater runoff, water pollution, and flooding. Final slide, please. Well, I guess it's not the final, but next one. So it's sort of our conclusion in talking with Director Parfit and Director Gephardt that really, these are going to be a case-by-case determination. If in fact we were to set up a program, we would imagine that the three agencies would continue to work together to consult as well as work with EPA to make sure that these programs that we believe still qualify or are eligible under the drinking water and clean water SRF eligibility criteria.
Chairman, Director Scoggins, up in my part of the world in Fremont County, there's just really been a lot of interest in projects that would impact these, would use this, but really some uncertainty on how this may even be back to the governor's office. So if a municipality is wanting to use their own ARP money, then they come back through one of the agencies to say that it qualifies, that this qualifies. Is there going to be, you talked about an infusion maybe of money into the program? Is that how that's going to work? Or are we just going to have the funds out there and then an entity says we've got a project and it meets the needs and then it's funded from another source? And then you talk about the intended use plan. Is there going to be a requirement then for those projects to be included in the intended use plan? It's probably the same questions you've been asking. So if you could just maybe help me a little bit there so I could give some guidance.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I'll try and answer a little bit, but then I'll defer some of this to Beth Blackwell because she's been in closer contact with EPA and some of the other folks, so she might have a better idea. I'm sure your questions are largely aligned with some of my questions, which happen to be with ARPA. It's unclear whether the current SRF requirements will be required. I don't think so. It sounds to us like the only well, not the only, but one of the requirements obviously is eligibility through drinking water SRF, clean water SRF. The indications are to us that they would not have to be on the IUP list, and that if in fact you're using ARPA funds for it, and Director Parfit and I were talking about this previously, it's still a little unclear whether you're going to have to meet all of those federal requirements like NEPA and all that. We have some things that say no, but we don't know. You know, with the Treasury, we're always getting new guidance all the time. And so, and with that, I would defer to Beth Blackwell to answer your question about local money versus state money.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I was lucky enough to attend a breakout session at WAM last week that Madam Auditor had presented at, and she stated that the funds that the individual municipalities receive is their responsibility. So it's much different than where CARES Act was the state's responsibility. So that's why we had to vet everything before we awarded and did everything. With these funds, since they were directly dispersed to the communities, it is their responsibility to make sure that the use of their funds is an eligible use. It does not come back to the state per what the auditor has stated in her presentation.
Mr. Chairman, Beth, that's if they're using their own money.
Correct.
But if they're going to apply for ARP money through the state, that falls into a different program. Okay. And do we have
Mr. Chairman, as I understand this, the point of this discussion is this is deemed an eligible use of the dollars. The governor has not decided that he supports allocating X amount for this or anyone else. This is just to make sure we all are on the same page, that this is an eligible use. And this is a briefing so you understand the shape of that. If you all decide that that's where you want to go, and if the governor starts heading down that road, you'll know out of some general reasons why. One of the things we have heard a lot about is that a lot of these projects are not affordable for a municipality. Municipalities are the ones who are often the ones responsible for the water infrastructure, and they wouldn't be able to cover one of these projects or a larger project on their own in that space. So if we are going to, as a state, decide that this is a prudent investment, then we're going to likely need to put some of the state ARPA dollars in to help municipalities.
So just to follow up on that, as select water, I presume the most logical ones would be to look at projects that are already in the pipeline. And that you prioritized for need on a need basis. So have they looked at any of the, and then instead of using the MRG dollars or other dollars, they would just substitute in ARPA dollars to move forward with them? Has that taken place yet, or have those discussions taken place?
Mr. Chairman, again, the governor has not decided that this is one of the uses that he's going to push for. So I think that would be a consideration that he'd work with you all on that, likely after or as a consideration during the session. So no, not until the session will there be any dollars going into this account for this purpose is the plan right now. So if the strike team, for example, all of a sudden sees that there's some urgent and important need for these dollars in the coming months, then we'd be talking to you at the strike team about it. But at this point, know that this would be something we'd work on together in the year ahead.
And so we don't know if select water has kind of gone down that road yet. Is anyone here on select water? You? There, yeah. Where are we?
Mr. Chairman, we have not. So let's make something really clear. Lander, for example, the reason they're interested in the ARPA money is because it's grant. They could come now in front of SLIB and ask if they had a water treatment plant, for example, they could come and get loan money there. But all the communities are wondering, gosh, can we use our own money and then supplement it with the grant money? And as far as the Select Water Committee, we haven't been given any direction at all. Is that money going to be by the legislature? Is it going to be earmarked to the SLIB program and they would administer it? Or is it going to be earmarked through the legislative process through the Water Development Commission or specifically earmarked by us? Those questions are still out there waiting for direction from the federal government.
Okay.
Chairman?
Mr. Chairman.
So I mean, so I look at these things, I mean, Mr. Chairman, if we can just follow up on that line of questioning from our friends from Water Development Commission or anybody else that might have that information. I mean, normally what happens is those projects are submitted and embedded to the Water Development Commission. That they get the folks from water quality, take a look at those things. And then they're presented. And so then there's a bill that comes out for, water account 1 and water account 2. And that's kind of how we've always done that. So, I mean, if we're going to look at this, somebody needs to start to look at those projects. Or are we going to invite a whole new series of projects? Or are we looking to try and shift some of the projects? And a lot of those are half or a third loan, at least, or sometimes 2/3 loan, 1/3 grant. Or are we going to try and look at that? I mean, ultimately, is that going to fall to JAC? Is Water Development, Water Select going to take that on, or is the Development Commission going to take that on? I mean, somehow we ought to figure this out. I mean, we have the briefing. We kind of understand now that some of this is going to be available. There's also, I think, some push if they ever get a infrastructure bill out of Congress, they're trying to push water as infrastructure. So, I mean, at some point that's going to happen. And so somewhere we need to have a division of labor to figure out how to do this. That's something, Mr. Chairman, I'd be interested if you have some thoughts about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Part of what's still at play, as Director Scoggins talked about here, is there's a lot that we don't know yet about this program. So, Mr. Co-Chairman, what you just mentioned about water development, water storage projects, right now we're not sure are going to qualify. So we're waiting to see if those types of projects qualify, or if we're only talking about more of the projects that move through SLIP. So there's a lot to learn. This has definitely been a big topic among states in their feedback to Treasury. And that feedback was all due at the end of last week. So A lot of people, I think a lot of municipalities are weighing in on this too nationally to say, we need more clarity about this. So hopefully we'll have better guidance out and then we can set up a better plan for exactly who is going to do this. What type of program do we want to consider, if any program at all?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
For Director Scoggins, I think one of our goals on these ARP dollars is to try to leverage them as much as we can. So there's going to be about $500 million that we've got to spend in one of four categories: water, sewer, broadband, tourism, essentially, maybe with some other flexibility. So it's very likely, I think, that there'll be going to be a significant portion of that amount that does get spent on water and sewer projects somehow. Structurally, is it easier to require the municipalities or local governments to match the funds if it were some kind of block allocation from the legislature to SLIB with certain criteria? And my question, to make this a question, is could you mix and match so that, for example, a hypothetical city in Southwest Wyoming that has a $30 million ask for a water project, we might want them to kick in 20% of that amount. They don't have $6 million on hand. Could you then combine that with one of your loan programs so that they can borrow their matching amount?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, I'll defer that to Beth Blackwell, but I would note that if in fact we came through an existing loan program and it, like if SRF were the case, then a project that otherwise wouldn't have all those federal requirements like Davis-Bacon and all that now has them if you take money out of SRF. So that would be one thing to think about in that regard. But there may be other loan programs, our construction loan program or others. Mr. Chairman, with that, I'd yield to Beth if she had more to add on to that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, the ability to match an ARPA, say a grant using ARPA funds, would be based on the community's financial health. We do a financial analysis for each of our loans using the prior 3 years financial history to determine whether they're able to take on additional debt. Within that analysis, we also look at all their current debt payments as well as the new potential payment, because we want to make sure not only are we going to get paid back, that everybody else who has debt outstanding to the entity will also get paid back. So it's truly a case-by-case basis. Some communities are really good at working with us to adjust their rates to make it so they can afford a loan. Other communities just wait and decide not to take out a loan and wait till they pay off some debt and then they come back. So it's truly based on an entity's ability to debt finance and their willingness to.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Beth, maybe this is to you, but with the federal requirements associated with the use of the ARP funds, and particularly the environmental assessment and NEPA process, could that then potentially take some of these projects off the consideration if we have to use those funds up in 3-4 years? And we see those assessments maybe taking that long. Would that is that a fair observation or not?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, the federal requirements add a burden. I think the one that adds the largest burden and may slow projects down more than anything would be your American iron and steel requirement. As we all know, the supply chain of commodities right now is not great. And so items are costing more and taking longer lead time to receive. So I think that's more of a potential to slow down these program or these projects than the environmental review. Generally, if you're replacing water lines, you have a category exclusion because you are taking out water lines and replacing them in the same footprint. So it's very dependent on the project, what level of environmental review has to take place and how long it takes.
Virgin country and expanding stormwater, a number of those, then is it fair to think that that could come into play? And that's going to have to be done before you ever think about ordering anything, right?
Correct.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps Director Parfit would want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, just to follow up with what has already been said, the type of NEPA projects that we're talking about here aren't the same as the ones that we've seen coming out of, say, the BLM and some of the EISs and so forth. These are much smaller in scope, and as was referenced, a lot of them can fall into the categorical exclusion. So the time frame involved is much less than what you would see for some of these larger NEPA documents.
How are you?
Doing well.
Okay, further questions? Go ahead, Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my question would be, in thinking about all of this and the supply chain problems that we're having and all of that, are there any, maybe Director Gephardt could tell us, are there any projects that are in the pipeline through water development right now that are shovel ready that we could replace our general funds or our water development funds with these ARPA dollars like we have done in other agencies? Have we looked into that, or could we look into that and see if there might be something that we could offset?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, some of the projects that come directly to mind would be I believe we have a list of projects that are already receiving loan money from one of the SRF programs. And I guess theoretically, those projects would qualify. I wouldn't say that all of them would, because there may be components of a project that may not qualify or something to that effect. But of the projects we have in the pipeline, those would be the first ones that we could look at. And then some of the other ones, if they have not applied for SRF, and depending on what level of project they are, they may not qualify, or that they may have not done the necessary upfront planning to qualify. So certainly something we could look at, but that's just my take on what we know right now.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
and so, I mean, as we think about this, and I mean, we appreciate the information today. I'm just trying to figure out how we move forward. And we don't have to make any decisions today, but I mean, obviously we have a new biennium coming up. And we're putting together budgets, Mr. Chairman, for the next biennium this fall. I think y'all are already into your budgets already. But as we look at this, I mean, just going back, and you go back and look at the construction projects on water development accounts. I mean, you go back through there, and a lot of those are for rural and domestic water supplies and other things like that. So I mean, I'm hoping that as we all have this information, we take this back, we try and figure out, again, it's about how do we get the best bang for our buck and get these projects done if we can do it, and relieve the debt burden on some local governments as they put their water supplies together. So much the better. But I'm hoping that as we pull this together, Mr. Chairman, that as we're putting these budgets and we're looking for those opportunities to put together, like the next omnibus water bill or the other projects that come forward, that somewhere we're looking at these things and trying to analyze where this all fits in as we get more information, so that we use it effectively and appropriately. But I hope that's where we're all heading. I think that's maybe what we're all getting to. We're just briefing because we know some things, but there's sure a lot we don't know yet.
Mr. Chairman, I could just respond to Senator Perkins. Senator Perkins, as Rennie indicated, there's a lot we don't know right now. But one of the things that we've talked about internally with DEQ and water development is we might consider utilizing ARPA money for planning studies, particularly if there's going to be more money coming through infrastructure funding through federal government. And then there are discussions, and I don't think Beth talked about that, but there have been discussions with EPA that is going to be a lot more money on the capitalization grants available for SRF too, which could also help then construct those projects, but perhaps get out on the planning end of it with some of the funding first. That would be an idea that we had.
Okay, further questions? Well, thank you very much. That's getting us in the right direction. Yeah. Okay, it's 11:44. Where are we on our? It's probably a good time to. Don, what's your take? You want to start off on our 15 minutes or?
Mr. Chairman, at minimum, I think Senator Boner has been waiting online, and I think he has some comments about the ag business and the meat processing bills
Okay,
that were
why don't
adopted.
let's jump into that for him. So he doesn't have to come back after lunch. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, well, hello, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, very good. We'll go ahead and appreciate the opportunity to discuss the two ag-related bills we had dealing with COVID assistance with this committee. Just thought I'd give you a little update as far as where we're at in my perspective on the relative importance of both the direct aid to ag producers as well as increasing meat processing capacity. And just want to say is that stands right now, I really think the priority needs to be on the continued attempts to increase our meat processing capacity in the state. And I think that's evidenced by the program that the governor's office instituted. You got an update about this morning regarding the $2 million for increasing that small to mid-sized processing capacity in the state. And I'm not sure if you've got update as to how many requests have gone in, but in discussing this with the governor's office over the weekend, they have about $6 million worth of requests, and they seem to be legitimate requests. That's a stark contrast to the similar, if not exact same program we had a year ago, where $5 million was on the table and we only expended about a little over $3 million. I think that is a strong indication that this industry, which basically did not exist in any meaningful way before the pandemic, is really starting to get its feet underneath it. It's important, I think, as we look at not just the security of the food supply chain, but I think we look at it as an opportunity too to add value to an important product that's produced in the state. I know that's certainly a focus of our economic development efforts. And there's going to be more opportunities potentially moving forward with the federal government looking into antitrust laws, looking to see maybe enforce that with a very consolidated meat packing industry. So I think moving forward, there's even more opportunity to add jobs, add that value to that product that's already produced in the state. And just want to give you that update, Mr. Chairman. As far as paths forward, I don't anticipate at this point having any new bills coming out of the Ag Committee on these subjects. Looks like we already have the program set up, and if anything, we might, I think any additional work we might want to do in this area could be accomplished easily through a budget footnote if it comes to that. Another important part of this is also the federal government is just announced last week that they're going to provide up to $500 million worth of loans similar to the program that Wyoming and other states have set up. So even though we're in excess of 4 million more requests than we have appropriated right now with the Remaining CARES Act funds, there's an opportunity for those same applicants to take advantage of the similar program to the USDA. So lots of moving parts, so lots of opportunities, I think, in this sector to, like I said, add value to a product that's already produced in Wyoming and provide some security in the supply chain, not just for our farmers and ranchers, but for our consumers as well. So, Mr. Chairman, looking forward to any direction this committee may have as to how to best proceed. I think I've shared my perspective, but certainly want to hear the committee's perspective and certainly stand for any questions you may have.
Okay, any questions for Senator Boner?
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
So thank you, and I appreciate it. I did check with somebody that I talked to during session a couple of times, and they have been awarded, they're in meat processing folks, and they were awarded a grant. I asked them what they thought that their issues were, and they think that the most limiting issue they have now is getting USDA inspection on, and so that they can, of their new facility, so that they can actually get the permit to process. The other thing that seems to be cropping up is, so anyway, my first question, Mr. Chairman, to Chairman Boner would be if we have any, if he has any insight with respect to the ability or the timing to have USD inspections of these plants so that this money could be expended, these folks can get up in a timely fashion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is certainly something that we've discussed. The Business Council does have a program to assist with jumping through the regulatory hoops associated with this USDA inspection. I do understand that's a limiting factor when it comes to actual inspectors themselves. There's only so many, and it's sort of a chicken and egg question that they're not going to have any new inspectors if there's not the capacity. But then again, you have to have some capacity in order to justify the inspector. So I'm not sure of anything we can do directly to help with literally getting these federal employees to all these new USDA inspected plants. Certainly, I think something we need to be cognizant of at the state level with our state inspected plants, and make sure there's not a bottleneck there. But it's sort of helping with the paperwork, which is significant in and of itself. I'm unaware of anything the state can do directly to assist with ensuring that we have enough federal employees to conduct these inspections.
Mr. Chairman, one follow-up, if I may.
Go ahead.
And so Chairman Boner, another issue I just was curious about was, I think you assisted, or if not led the charge kind of on having, trying to get local beef and local pork, maybe even local poultry into local school systems, and so being able to use that in the school lunch programs and I'm just wondering, is there anything that the state needs to do in order to make sure, if we have meat processors, that these things are now that so we will have locally processed beef, poultry, and pork, that we can actually get that into school systems and have school systems be a customers for these for this part of the ag industry?
Mr. Chairman, in terms of one-time expenditures, I think an additional thing we can do at the state level is perhaps provide some grants for the capacity within our schools. So literally, I mean, they need freezer space, things like that. Of course, that has a cost associated with it. That I think that would be a good complement to the existing program, which is sort of a cost share with the local district for the processing costs. So if we're looking at expending one-time funds, that'll have a benefit over the long term. I think that would be the one thing that immediately comes to mind, is perhaps provide some grants to upgrade the infrastructure in our school districts so they can have more of a storage capacity, because that is a constraint as well.
Go ahead.
Chairman Boner, this is Representative Larson. As I've pondered this meat processing thing, I'm just wondering if you could walk me through, because you're the expert on it, and I certainly am not. So if we bring this industry into the state at the level that you were wanting to, some in hopefully even being USDA certified, can you walk me through? There's no corporate tax that the entity is going to have to pay. So where does the taxation on that product start when the livestock producer sells to the processing plant? Do they pay a tax on the livestock they buy, or on the other end, after the slaughter has taken place and are processed, is there a sales tax paid on by the consumer that buys it direct, or maybe if it's a USDA plant, the retail seller, do they pay it? Or is it the end use when I buy it at the local store?
Well, that's an excellent question, Mr. Chairman. I wish I had an answer off the top of my head. I certainly, you know, you're going to pay a, you know, I know these facilities are going to pay property taxes. As far as sales tax, I'm not aware of any that occurs as that goes through the process, but it's certainly something that I could look up and get back to the committee on. My only personal experience is processing our own livestock for our personal use, and I don't believe there's a sales tax associated with that. But I'd have to double check. I'm a little embarrassed I don't have an answer to that question. But certainly, when you look at the overall tax structure, you know, obviously these facilities come online, you'll have somebody paying an industrial rate for property tax. That's going to be a benefit to the state. And I could definitely get back to the sales tax question.
If you would, I'm just curious. I figured you producers probably had a better feel for that than I did. And just curious is because in one hand, Mr. Chairman, we're talking about providing grants to the school district so that they can have capacity that comes out of our general fund. We need to, you know, so how do we work all of that where it's not just a one-way drain? So Chairman Boner, thank you. Appreciate that conversation. And if you get any further light knowledge, if you could share that with me, I'd be grateful.
Okay, any further questions for Senator and Chairman Boner? Okay. Don, what's next?
Mr. Chairman, just to wrap up this agenda item, we did reach out to the prior sponsors of the other, I guess it would be the other 4 bills related to ARP funds that were adopted during this session. And we did not receive any additional comment from other chairmen or sponsors of those legislation. However, you should have received a letter from the Broadband Task Force. Representative Summers and Representative Newsom indicated they would not be available due to a conflict. And they did forward along not only a letter from the Broadband Task Force, but some initial draft legislation for broadband within the state.
So committee, what I thought we would do, and we can do this starting right after lunch, is basically just walk through the bills briefly. So we understand what was asked for and where it was supposed to come from and what the purposes were for it. Because at some point, we're going to have to start keeping a running tally of each one. And as this modifies, and with it, for example, with this particular one having to do with meat packing processing, we may want to send the bill back to the Ag Committee with questions and a breakdown of more specifics, so I understand kind of what the need is and just get more information on it. 'Cause I think if we then continue to work this, we're just going to need more information on them anyway. And we may even divide them up amongst our committee just to come up with some mechanism of how we deal with each one of these. Because, you know, they've been approved, they're in front of us because the legislature passed them out. So I think we have an obligation to kind of work through each one and how we want to then further address them as we get into our budgeting process in December. So with that, I think that it's 11:57. So Don, what I anticipate, we just kind of want to walk through the bills after lunch. I can also say that, for example, on the large project bill, I was contacted by the chairman of Minerals and also the vice chair. And I explained to him that at this point, we're just kind of re-acquainting ourselves with the bills. So we weren't going to go into a great deal of detail on them. And that we would probably do that at a later date so that they didn't have to participate, just to walk through the bill with us at this time. So any questions about that or comments or suggestions? All right, so we'll come back at 1 o'clock and we'll walk through those bills then. Any public comment on for anyone out there on Senator Boner's descriptions or questions about the stock feeding, or anything that we had from the earlier folks with the state clean water issues? All right, I see none, so we will stand in recess till 1 o'clock.